Chapter 265. Before dawn, when the sky was still gloomy and dark, Lu Chen and Atsu arrived at the outskirts of the evil Python Valley. In the dark, they couldn't see what the valley looked like. It was said that there were snakes and poisonous creatures everywhere, but the unique smell of snakes and insects in the wind indicated the danger ahead. They were still in the open area outside the evil Python Valley. If it was just the smell of ordinary snakes, it would probably be blown away by the wind. However, the smell was still so strong even though they were so far away. One could imagine how many snakes and poisonous creatures there were in the valley. Atsu was restless beside Lu Chen. This was rare. Even when they were escaping, Lu Chen didn't see Atsu have this kind of reaction. He stood beside Atsu and gently hugged its neck. Then Atsu quickly quieted down. There was a cold wind in the dark night, but the man and the dog could still feel a trace of warmth between each other. The road ahead is a bit difficult and dangerous. If it were someone else, I would think of a way to let them go. Lu Chen said with a sigh, but you are so stupid and so gullible. I really don't want to let you go. Atsu turned his head and glanced at him, his two eyes glowing with green light. Lu Chen laughed and waved his hand. Let's go, goo goo goo. Before he finished speaking, he heard a strange sound beside him. It was Atsu's stomach growling. Lu Chen froze for a moment, then realized what was going on. After a day and a night of running for their lives, Atsu wasn't a human cultivator. As a monster beast, and one that had just evolved, it was only natural that it would be hungry. For a moment, Lu Chen suddenly felt a little warm on his cheeks and eyes at the same time. Because he had been too nervous for this day and night, or perhaps because he had long been used to letting Atsu find food for himself when he was on Mount Kunlun, he had actually forgotten about this matter. And Atsu, who was supposed to be a mischievous fellow, actually followed him all the way to escape with all his might, never abandoning him, never complaining or regretting, not even a single word of complaint. Lu Chen took a deep breath in the dark and smiled. He patted Atsu's head and said softly, "Let's go find something to eat." It was not an easy task to look for food before the sun rose, especially considering that Atsu was no longer the same as before. Normal meat was no longer attractive to him. At least when Lu Chen offered him some dry rations, Atsu looked at it with disdain and almost snorted in disdain. Well, a holy beast that had evolved naturally needed to eat higher quality food. Ordinary meat was not enough, so they could only look for monsters. The most obvious place to look for monsters was the evil Python Valley. However, entering a valley full of poisonous creatures in the middle of the night was no different from seeking death. Lu Chen didn't want to go, and the half-starved Atsu didn't want to go either. It looked like it was disgusted by the fishy smell. Therefore, Lu Chen could only bring Atsu to the mountain ridge next to the evil Python Valley. He wanted to see if he could catch a few unlucky demonic beasts and feed them to this saint beast who was good at escaping. Then, when the sun rose, he would think of a way to pass through the evil Python Valley and go straight to the Dragon River. The evil Python Valley was, in fact, a valley that had suddenly sunk in the middle of a majestic mountain range that stretched for tens of thousands of miles. Although the damp and gloomy environment had bred countless poisonous insects and monsters, in terms of terrain, the evil Python Valley was actually one of the most convenient paths to the Dragon River. Of course, if it was someone at the level of the Yuanying stage, they would naturally not fear the high mountains and the strong wind that could disperse spiritual energy in the sky. They could directly fly over the top of the mountain. Although Lu Chen had a strange Taoist technique like the Black Flame, which was very powerful in actual combat, he was not good at flying. Moreover, apart from himself, there was also a huge black wolf Atsu following him. It was even more impossible for him to fly over the mountain ridge. Therefore, when he and Atsu walked up the nearest mountain ridge and looked at the mountains in front of them, they couldn't help but let out a sigh. But very soon he suddenly turned around and looked back. Behind him was the pitch-black night. Darkness was everywhere, but other than that, there seemed to be nothing and no movement. However, just now, Lu Chen clearly felt that strange, cold gaze like that of a poisonous snake again. He frowned, and after a while, he turned around expressionlessly and walked up with Atsu. However, this night, they didn't seem to be very lucky. After searching for a while on the mountain ridge, they didn't encounter any unlucky monsters that ran out. On this night, it seemed that all the monsters were comfortably staying in their nests, unwilling to come out and become the supper of a certain holy beast. Atsu was a little annoyed and irritated. Lu Chen also felt a little helpless. Just as he was wondering if he should continue to search deeper into the mountain ridge, Atsu suddenly raised its head and sniffed the air a few times. Then, it turned around and called out to Lu Chen. There was a hint of joy and excitement in its voice. Then, it ran in a certain direction. Lu Chen was stunned. At this moment, they were on the mountain ridge. Because they were at a place where there was wind, the stench from the evil Python Valley could no longer be smelled. But at this moment, Atsu seemed to have suddenly discovered something. Lu Chen didn't hesitate any longer because Atsu's running speed wasn't considered slow. Moreover, they were in the middle of the night in the Bedlam land, where danger lurked everywhere. Lu Chen decided to keep up. After following Atsu for about half an hour, the sky had already begun to brighten. A trace of morning light appeared on the horizon in the distance, sprinkling over this chaotic land. It was under this morning light that when Lu Chen and Atsu ran to an open area halfway up the mountain ridge, they suddenly stopped in their tracks. This was because in front of them, in what should have been a primitive, barbaric and uninhabited mountain ridge, there was suddenly a tribe that was obviously inhabited by humans. It was in a hidden call, leaning against a towering stone wall. There were a few large caves cut into the stone wall. Apart from that, there were many very crude houses built with wood and stones outside the caves. The morning light swept across this somewhat desolate and primitive tribe. Everything was quiet, there was no smoke, and no one was moving. It seemed that everyone there was still in a deep sleep. Lu Chen's pupils constricted as he stared at the tribe. His gaze moved from the caves to the crude but tall houses, and finally landed on the center of the tribe, on a pile of triangular stones that had been piled up during the chaos. There was a black piece of wood as thick as an arm stuck into the stone pile. There were some very strange patterns carved on it. Even though they were separated by such a distance, Lu Chen could still see it clearly. He felt that it was a little familiar. But for a moment, he couldn't remember where he had seen these totem-like things before. Totem. He frowned and thought hard. He didn't know why, but he had a hunch that this thing seemed to be very important, and he must remember it. And at this moment, suddenly, Atsu beside him growled in a low voice, but it showed a trace of excitement and joy. Lu Chen turned his head and looked at Atsu. He saw that Atsu's mouth was half open, as if he was about to drool, and his pair of dog eyes were staring at a certain place in the tribe without blinking. Lu Chen immediately followed Atsu's gaze and saw that outside a few wooden houses, there was a thick rope between two big trees, and on the rope, there were 7 or 8 things that looked like cured meat hanging upside down. This stupid dog probably couldn't resist looking at the food. However, for Atsu to be so excited, it must be the meat of monsters. Thinking about it, this tribe must be quite strong to be able to catch monsters, and there seemed to be quite a number of them. As he thought about it, Lu Chen suddenly felt that the things on the rope were a little familiar. To be exact, it was very similar to something he had heard of before. It was a monster that should have been on Rat Hill Mountain, the savage and bloodthirsty cloud rats. From afar, looking at the row of cloud rats that should have been flaunting their prowess and causing headaches, but were now killed, skinned, and hung upside down like cured meat, Lu Chen couldn't help but feel an indescribable sense of strangeness. Thinking back to the unusually peaceful journey through Rat Hill Mountain, Lu Chen couldn't help but feel his heart skip a beat. Could it be that this tribe hunted rats for a living, and managed to catch almost all of the cloud rats on Rat Hill Mountain? Beside him, Atsu couldn't help but rub its head against Lu Chen's body, a questioning look in its eyes. Lu Chen hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right, go on then. If there's anything wrong, run back here as soon as possible." Atsu let out a cheer, then ran down the mountain towards the tribe. Lu Chen didn't follow, but stared at Atsu's figure, watching as it slowly approached the mysterious tribe. There was no one in the tribe, and there were no barriers in the surroundings, such as fences or wooden palisades, so Atsu easily slipped through. However, as it neared the tribe, Atsu clearly became more cautious, constantly looking around furtively. Then, it slowly approached the hanging meat with light footsteps. After a moment, it suddenly leapt up and bit down on a cloud rat. With a forceful tug, it immediately pulled the thing down. Atsu turned and ran, but the commotion had already alerted some of the people in the tribe. A moment later, someone ran out from the nearest house, angrily cursing at Atsu. He even threw out a stone spear. With a tut, the stone spear pierced the spot where Atsu had just run, buzzing and vibrating nonstop. In the distance, Lu Chen's body suddenly trembled. Looking at the person cursing angrily in the morning light, his face was ferocious, his mouth was filled with fangs, and his forehead was painted with many strange patterns. In an instant, Lu Chen came to a realization. This was a barbarian. This tribe was a barbarian tribe. As for the totem pattern that gave him a familiar feeling, he had indeed seen it with his own eyes. It was the same totem pattern that he saw on the face of the fire shaman 10 years ago in the Battle of the Desolate Valley. Chapter 266. The scene from 10 years ago seemed to resurface in his mind in the blink of an eye. It was so clear that it seemed like it had happened just yesterday. Every single person's appearance, movement, and expression had been frequently recalled by Lu Chen over the past few years. It was as if they had been carved into the depths of his bones and could not be forgotten. The fire shaman was an exceptionally powerful barbarian. Even in front of the 3 highly respected elders of the demon cult of the 3 realms, he did not seem to be at a disadvantage. In fact, his aura was even stronger than theirs. The source of Lu Chen's pain for the past 10 years was the fire shaman. Ever since that day, the mysterious, strange, and incomparably powerful black flame curse had entangled him unwaveringly. He could not escape it even if he died. Sometimes, during the most painful moment when the black flame burned his body, Lu Chen would vaguely see an illusion of the fire shaman's old and ferocious face. The burning flames were like the old man's terrible curse, taking revenge for the sins he had committed. Lu Chen closed his eyes and took a deep breath. When he opened his eyes again after a while, his expression had completely calmed down. He looked at the tribe of barbarians that had suddenly appeared in front of him. His eyes were completely indifferent. It had been more than 10 years since that incident. It was a long and painful period of time, but he had never regretted it. There were barbarians in the disorienting lands. As for their origin, it was because of the earth-shattering war between the human race and the barbarians thousands of years ago. The barbarians suffered a crushing defeat and retreated to the southern wasteland. However, because of the overwhelming strength of both sides, the weather changed, the mountains collapsed, and the earth cracked. Even the topography of the disorienting lands had changed. After the shocking and bloody battle, most of the barbarians retreated. However, there was still a portion of barbarians that had been cut off from the disorienting lands forever, never to return to the southern wasteland. As the victors, the human race did not show any mercy to these barbarians. Once the barbarians were discovered, they would be killed. Hence, in the end, this group of barbarians were forced to escape into the depths of the land of chaos. To be more precise, they hid in the treacherous central region of the land of chaos. Only then did they barely manage to escape the pursuit of the human race. For many years, the barbarians could hardly be seen in the outskirts of the disordered lands. Only some old barbarians who had been cruelly exiled due to their old age could be seen occasionally. For example, the barbarian that Lu Chen and Xianxia saw was one such barbarian. Apart from that, the fact that the barbarian tribes could only barely survive in the central region of the chaotic lands was a well-known fact that was deeply ingrained in everyone's hearts. However, the scene before him clearly told Lu Chen that things seemed to have changed. Looking at the caves on the mountain walls and the many houses made of wood and stone, it was obvious that the size of this tribe was not small. There were at least over 100 people. For such a large tribe to sneak into the outskirts of the disordered lands without anyone noticing was indeed a shocking matter. Furthermore, looking at the houses and caves of the tribe, it was obvious that this tribe had been here for a long time. Why did these barbarians suddenly head north? Even if they risked being discovered by the human race, they still chose to secretly settle down on the north bank of the Dragon River. Lu Chen did not know the reason behind this, but he guessed that the central region on the south bank of the Dragon River was too dangerous. Or perhaps this small tribe could no longer withstand the many dangers there, so they decided to take this risk. Needless to say, the tribe had chosen a very clever location. In front of them was the Rat Mound Mountain, and behind them was the Evil Python Valley. Both were notoriously dangerous places. Normal humans would never come here. Even if there were people who happened to pass by, they would usually walk straight down the mountain. They would not think of running into the mountain valley to investigate, so it was very difficult to discover this tribe's hiding place. Unfortunately, Lu Chen and Atu discovered the location of this secret due to a stroke of luck on this day. Atu ran back with the cloud mouse in his mouth. He had long since shaken off the barbarians behind him. From afar, the barbarians could only curse a few times, then helplessly went to clean up the mess. Passing through the rocks and trees, Atsu ran back to Lu Chen's side and placed the dead cloud rat in front of Lu Chen. It even wagged its tail at Lu Chen, looking very pleased with itself. Lu Chen smiled and patted its head, saying, "You're amazing." Atsu didn't stand on ceremony. It buried its head and began to chew away. The cloud rat was a type of demonic beast. The spiritual energy contained in its flesh was much stronger than that of ordinary wild beasts. It was just right for Atsu's current situation. It seemed to be eating with relish. As for Lu Chen, he naturally wouldn't fight with Atsu for food. He only looked at the tribe from afar, carefully observing it. As the morning sun shone down, the sky gradually brightened. More people in the tribe began to wake up. Lu Chen saw more barbarians, and he also saw that their faces were covered with strange tattoos. They looked very familiar. They seemed very similar to the tattoos on the face of the fire shaman 10 years ago. Lu Chen's face became more and more stern and cold. Atu happily finished his feast. Although the cloud mouse was much smaller than him, Atu seemed to be very satisfied with his meal. He even let out a loud burp as he walked up to Lu Chen. Of course, it wasn't because it had eaten too much meat, but because Atsu's body was absorbing the rich spiritual energy contained in the cloud rat's flesh. Lu Chen looked down at Atsu, then softly said, "Let's go, Atsu. Let's go take a look over there." As he spoke, he brought Atu along as he flashed towards the tribe. Of course, Lu Chen wasn't stupid enough to walk straight through the gate. Instead, he used the surrounding terrain and forest to circle around, slowly approaching the tribe from the back. As he got closer, he could see many things more clearly. The men and women of the tribe, and even some of the children, all had tattoos on their faces. It seemed to be some kind of tradition passed down from ancient times, or perhaps it was some kind of religious totem. Most of them were very similar. From this, it seemed that the fire shaman of the past was inextricably linked to this tribe. But as Lu Chen carefully observed, he quickly came to a somewhat surprising conclusion. This tribe didn't seem to be very strong. Not to mention the incomparably terrifying fire shaman of the past, Lu Chen didn't even see a single barbarian that was even half as powerful as that expert. He even vaguely remembered that during the Battle of the Desolate Valley, the fire shaman had brought along 7 incomparably powerful barbarian warriors. They were similarly terrifying existences that inspired awe and veneration, but he also didn't see them in this tribe. This morning, the barbarians walking around in this barbarian tribe looked like a group of slightly stronger and stronger people. But in the eyes of human cultivators, these barbarians were no different from helpless rabbits. So after a while, Lu Chen's gaze turned towards the few caves on the mountain wall in the depths of the tribe. The disorienting lands was extremely cruel and realistic. Without strength, one wouldn't be able to survive. For this tribe to be able to survive until now, they should have some sort of background. If there were any experts around, they should be in the cave. Atsu accompanied Lu Chen in the hidden forest for a while. Gradually, it became a little impatient and softly called out a few times. Lu Chen patted its head and said, "Don't worry, these barbarians can be considered as my enemies. Moreover, they are of some use to us." About an hour after dawn, under the watchful eyes of Lu Chen, the tribe suddenly changed. Everyone walked out of their wooden houses and came to the center of the tribe, surrounding the pyramid that was pierced by black wood. After a while, from the cave under the mountain wall, people started to walk out one after another. Just as Lu Chen expected, The barbarians that came out of the cave this time were much stronger than the barbarians that came out of the cave. Not only did the warriors look sturdier and stronger, but there was also an old priest that came out from the back of the crowd that was surrounded and protected by many strong warriors. In the system of the barbarian tribes, the shaman held a supreme position. He represented the ability to communicate with the most sacred ancient ancestors of the barbarian world, and obtain the power that had been passed down from ancient times. However, powerful individuals like the shaman were rare. They needed the right time, the right place, and the right people, as well as an especially good opportunity. Therefore, in most of the barbarian tribes in the southern continent, there were more people like the priest who were of a lower rank. People like the shaman or the priest basically occupied the leading position in the barbarian tribes. They possessed the rare wisdom of the barbarians, who were known for their brute strength. They were the backbone that guided the growth and development of the tribe. At the same time, they were also the minority of the barbarians who could master the shaman witchcraft. This kind of power, which was completely different from the cultivation world of the central continent, was extremely powerful. During the 1,000-Year War, countless people were plunged into misery and suffering. And now, Lu Chen's gaze was fixed on the old priest in the crowd. His eyes flickered. The old priest looked so old that even his fangs had fallen out. He walked with a trembling gait, as if he was a candle that had one foot in the grave. If it was according to the cruel survival rules of the barbarian tribes in the chaotic lands, this old man would have been banished from the tribe long ago and left to fend for himself. But of course, the priest was different. The strong barbarian warriors around the old man clustered around him, their eyes filled with reverence. Then, they slowly walked to the center of the tribe and stood in front of the pile of stones. After the old priest steadied himself, he began to stretch out his hands. Facing the strange black wood, he began to chant some kind of strange and sorrowful song. Along with this song, all the barbarians knelt on the ground, prostrated themselves on the ground, and kowtowed to the totem carved on the black wood. Their faces were filled with reverence and yearning. Lu Chen looked at all this indifferently, then he raised his head and looked in the direction of the mountain ridge that he had come from. He thought to himself, those righteous evil cult assassins who enforce justice on behalf of the heavens should be catching up soon. Chapter 267. An ancient and sorrowful song was drifting in the wilderness, like a lonely river of time flowing through the endless years. At the same time as the song drifted in the air, the black wooden block on top of the pile of stones suddenly lit up. In the distance, Lu Chen's pupils contracted slightly. At that moment, he clearly saw the strange pattern that was originally engraved on the black wooden block began to glow. From the very beginning, it slowly spread along the pattern until the entire wooden block was lit up. When all the patterns on the black wooden block, which was also the totem, were completely lit up, all the barbarians who were kneeling in the surroundings shouted in unison. Their voices were majestic and full of reverence, as if they were telling their ancestor about their endless worship. At this moment, a ball of flame suddenly ignited from the black wooden block and began to burn fiercely. The barbarians' shouts became louder and louder, and many of them kept kowtowing. In the distance, Lu Chen's body suddenly trembled. He only felt that his ocean of qi was churning, as if the sky and earth were spinning, and the divine wheel was reversing. He let out a muffled groan, and stretched out his right hand, subconsciously grabbing a small tree next to him. In an instant, black flames gushed out from his palm, and burned the small tree into charcoal. However, this sudden throbbing came and went very quickly. Not long after, the black flames disappeared from Lu Chen's hands and eyes, and he returned to normal. However, Lu Chen's eyes revealed a hint of shock. Then, his eyes stared at the pile of stones that was surrounded by the barbarians, and the black wooden block that was stuck upside down on top of the pile of stones. There was something strange about that black wooden block. Lu Chen made this judgment in a split second. Because for so long, especially after he had swallowed and mastered that strange black flame, the only thing that could make the black flame in his body lose control was the unknown mysterious force in the forbidden area of Kunlun Mountain. Apart from that, it seemed like there was only the blackwood of this mysterious tribe. Of course, the difference in strength between the two could be said to be like heaven and earth. Both were caused by the resonance in Lu Chen's black fire power. However, the power in the depths of Kunlun Mountain was so powerful that it was almost impossible for a human to contend against it. On the other hand, the black fire resonance that the piece of black wood in front of him could be said to be very weak. In fact, it only took a moment for Lu Chen to regain control of the black fire in his body. This piece of black wood was actually related to the power of black fire. This discovery made Lu Chen very surprised. But when he thought that the fire shaman might have come from this tribe, everything seemed to be explainable. Lu Chen even vaguely guessed that perhaps it was his ambush in the desolate valley that killed the fire shaman. After losing such a powerful shaman, as well as the 7 abnormally powerful barbarian warriors who followed the fire shaman to the desolate valley, this tribe must have inevitably weakened. From the looks of it, he and this tribe were really fated. Of course, Lu Chen was not a soft-hearted person. He looked at the scene of the destitute barbarian tribe below. His expression did not change. His pair of eyes stared at the piece of wood most of the time, deep in thought. Then, as if he sensed something, he suddenly raised his head and looked into the distance. He saw that at the entrance of the call, there were a few sword lights flying in the sky. The forest on the ground was quiet, but occasionally a few birds would suddenly fly up in fright, flapping their wings and flying away from the forest. Lu Chen pursed his lips. After a moment of silence, he stood up and led Atsu down the dense foliage of the forest, slowly approaching the quiet tribe. Stay here and don't go out. Otherwise, your appearance will be too conspicuous. People will recognize you at a glance. Lu Chen brought Atsu along as they slowly walked through the forest. He crouched down behind a bush that was the closest to the barbarian tribe. He then instructed Atsu, "Wait for me here. When those people come in, I will also go down for a while. I should be back soon." Woof. Atsu seemed to understand Lu Chen's words, but it obviously did not agree. After lowering its voice and growling, it opened its mouth and gently bit the leg of Lu Chen's pants. It looked like it did not want him to go down and die. "Don't worry," Lu Chen patted Atsu's head and said, "I'm not as stupid as you. How could anything happen to me?" Atsu glared at him, its fangs crisscrossed, as if it was considering whether it should just bite this person to death. Lu Chen did not seem to feel anything. He hugged its neck and said to Atsu, "I have my own plan." Then, Atsu's eyes widened as it saw Lu Chen put his hand to his chest. After a while, he suddenly took out a set of black clothes. Then he slowly took off his outer clothes and put on a black outfit. At this moment, Lu Chen's appearance was almost similar to the man in black who chased after him a few days ago. When he took out a black cloth and covered his face, there was no trace of the original Lu Chen. He looked like a devil cult killer. Atsu's eyes were fixed on him. Lu Chen smiled and then said to Atsu, "Thanks to my cleverness, I still have the black clothes that I snatched from Qingshatang village. Today, it will come in handy." The strange ceremony in the barbarian tribe was very long and boring, but none of the barbarians had any complaints about it. Every one of them looked very reverent. Obviously, to the barbarians, this worship of their ancestors was the most important thing in their lives. The old shaman never stopped singing. But perhaps it was because he was too old, or because his ability was limited. In the end, his physical strength obviously could not keep up. He had to rely on the support of a few barbarian warriors beside him to continue singing. But even so, the shaman did not have the slightest intention of giving up. He never stopped singing the ancient song. Even further away, the sword gleams that were circling in the sky slowly descended. In the end, they landed almost soundlessly in a forest outside of the kernel. After a while, more than 10 figures walked out of the forest, one after another. They stood on the hillside of the mountain forest, looking at the mysterious barbarian tribe from afar. Lu Chen could even see the shock in the gazes and expressions of the people on the other side. None of the black-clothed men expected to see such a scene in the wilderness. Soon, the group of people began to talk to each other, and even started to argue. Some of the men in black pointed to the distance and passed the tribe. It seemed to mean that the important matter was more important. But at the same time, there were also men in black pointing to the barbarian tribe in the call and saying something excitedly. At first, There were only 1 or 2 people in such a dispute. But soon, other people joined in. Then it quickly developed to the point that almost all the men in black joined in. They were divided into 2 groups that were almost evenly matched. The barbarians in the tribe were still focused on the strange ceremony. The men in black did not make a loud noise to disturb them. Lu Chen was quietly lurking on the other side of the tribe, patiently waiting. Finally, the men in black in the forest came to a final conclusion after an intense but low-key debate. Lu Chen stared at the forest. He saw the dozens of men in black slowly spread out. It was like a big net with sharp hooks with a murderous aura. It slowly surrounded the tribe. Many people took out their magical weapons in silence. The cold brilliance of the weapons glittered in the morning sun, as if they were thirstily waiting for blood to be poured on them. In the barbarian tribe, the old priest who was chanting suddenly trembled slightly. He seemed to have sensed something. He suddenly raised his head and looked at the surrounding forest. However, it was also at this moment that a flame soared into the sky. It was like a soul-chasing command talisman. In an instant, the surrounding forest around the tribe was filled with roars. The roars were like dragons and tigers, surging from all directions. Dozens of black figures rushed over at the same time. The sword light filled the sky. The trees fell and the trees were broken. The cold eyes of the god of death swept across the small kernel. The next moment, it was time for blood to splatter. Roar! A roar like that of a demon beast rang out from the crowd of barbarians. The strong warriors rushed out and greeted the men in black with their flesh and blood. But their enemies were the extremely powerful cultivators of the human race. They possessed terrifying strength and many magical techniques. Not to mention, they had the help of many magical weapons. From the beginning of the battle, there was a great disparity between the strong and the weak. At the moment of the first collision, blood splattered everywhere. At least 4 barbarian warriors were directly cut down. One of them was even brutally cut in half by the incomparably sharp immortal sword of the human race. In an instant, the barbarian tribe was filled with screams and cries. It was probably the relatives of the warriors who died in the battle. These originally strong barbarians were now like frightened sheep, frantically fleeing in all directions. Only the old priest's eyes were red. He suddenly raised both of his hands and muttered an incantation. Then, several red lights shot out from his hands and submerged into the barbarian warriors' bodies. Suddenly, the barbarian warriors roared wildly. Their bodies suddenly increased in size. They were almost like monsters. Their strength also increased by more than 2 times. They actually used this courage to temporarily block the attack of the men in black. But this strange method could not last long. Not all barbarian warriors could withstand the red light of the priest. Only 5 or 6 of the strongest barbarian warriors could. They blocked half of the men in black. But in other directions, the rest of the men in black had directly rushed into the tribe. In an instant, blood splattered everywhere. Swords were stained with hot blood. Heads fell to the ground and severed limbs flew. It was a bloody scene. The old priest seemed to be angry. He let out a loud roar and actually spat out a mouthful of blood. At the same time, in the chaos, no one noticed that Lu Chen, who was dressed in black and had his face covered with a black cloth, had also quietly entered the village. Then he directly rushed towards the pile of stones. Chapter 268. More than a dozen experienced and highly skilled human cultivators charged into the barbarian tribe. They looked like a pack of tigers charging into a pen of sheep. Other than a few strong barbarian warriors who were at the forefront, who could barely resist for a while, the rest of the people, regardless of their age or gender, were no match for them. Even though the barbarians were fierce by nature, and many of them still picked up weapons, sticks, and stones to fight to the death, but in front of the incomparably sharp divine weapons, all of these were like pieces of paper, completely defenseless. In an instant, the barbarians were thrown off their feet, and blood splattered in all directions. This group of black-robed men were obviously used to seeing blood and death. Once they made a decision to attack, they did not show any mercy in the face of such a tragic situation. They could be said to have a heart of stone. For a moment, The tribe was filled with cries and screams of pain. There was a continuous stream of people lying in pools of blood, twitching as they died. Fresh blood and broken limbs could be seen everywhere. Lu Chen was already in the village of this tribe. When he saw this scene, his footsteps paused for a moment. He did not have a good impression of the barbarians. To be exact, he and the majority of the human race hated this race. Before the 1,000-Year War, the barbarians had invaded the Central Plains. The people were plunged into misery and suffering, and countless civilians died tragically. Moreover, the barbarians were savage by nature, and some tribes were so terrible that they even committed cannibalistic acts. Therefore, this was also the reason why until today, when the human cultivators discovered the remnants of the barbarians in the Land of Chaos, they would always kill them. Today's situation was obviously a conventional way for the black-robed men to kill the barbarians. The blood feud that had lasted for thousands of years could no longer be resolved. However, this barbarian tribe did not only consist of warriors, there were also the elderly, the weak, women, and children. This massacre obviously did not differentiate between them. Looking at the scene of the barbarians falling one after another, Lu Chen suddenly felt a little uncomfortable in his heart. Was his heart softening? Lu Chen shook his head slightly to get rid of these messy thoughts. Just as he was about to continue moving forward, a small figure suddenly staggered from the side. It was a barbarian boy. Half of his face was stained with blood, but he didn't know if it was his own or someone else's blood that had splattered onto his face. Looking from the direction he was running from, there was a swift and fierce black-clothed man wielding a weapon as he slaughtered. The boy seemed to have suffered quite a bit of shock and was running crazily to the other side. However, from the corner of his eye, Lu Chen saw that in the other direction he was running to, there was a black-clothed man killing his way over. Running over there seemed to be suicidal. When the barbarian kid ran past Lu Chen hesitated for a moment, but he still extended his hand and grabbed the boy. The barbarian kid screamed and turned his head to look at Lu Chen. The sharp fangs in his mouth were bared in anger, and he struggled with all his might. Lu Chen frowned, but he was too lazy to argue with him. He pushed the boy to the ground, and at the same time he pointed at the path that he had just come in from without batting an eyelid. There were no black-clothed men in that direction, so it was a way to escape. Immediately after, Lu Chen continued to walk forward. After all, his goal was not to save people, but to take advantage of the chaos to steal the mysterious black piece of wood that could actually resonate with the black fire in his body. However, he had only walked a few steps when he suddenly heard a gust of wind behind him. Lu Chen frowned and turned around to look. He saw that the boy had a terrified expression on his face and was running towards him. He suddenly jumped up and threw himself into Lu Chen's arms. Was it because he was too frightened? So when he saw someone showing kindness, he felt that it was a shelter that he could rely on? Lu Chen looked at the boy and reached out to catch him. However, after a moment, his expression suddenly changed. His right hand suddenly reached down and grabbed the hand of the barbarian kid. The sharp edge of a small knife had already pierced through the clothes on his lower abdomen and was just about to reach his skin. The barbarian kid screamed crazily and desperately tried to stab the sharp knife into Lu Chen's stomach. However, Lu Chen's hand was like iron to him, and it did not move at all. Lu Chen grabbed the barbarian kid, and his eyes had already turned cold. After a moment, he suddenly said, "When others kill people and bleed, you are so scared that you don't dare to fight back and run around. I saw that you are pitiful, so I saved you and helped you, but you want to kill me?" The barbarian kid let out a beast-like roar. It was unknown whether he understood Lu Chen's words, but his face was full of viciousness. He gritted his teeth and desperately tried to push the knife in his hand to stab Lu Chen to death. After trying for a while, but to no avail, he suddenly opened his mouth and bit down on Lu Chen's right wrist. At the same time, the strength in his hand increased greatly. It was obvious that he wanted to use this opportunity to get away from Lu Chen and then stab into Lu Chen's lower abdomen. Lu Chen swung his hand, and the barbarian kid flew up involuntarily. Then, before he could recover, he felt that his neck had been grabbed by someone. At this time, the barbarian kid suddenly felt his vision darken. He saw that in addition to Lu Qin, there was also a black figure that suddenly appeared behind Lu Qin. It was another black-clothed man, and no one knew when he had stood behind Lu Qin. He glanced at the barbarian kid and said in a deep voice, "What's wrong?" Lu Qin's body stiffened. Just when he was about to move, the barbarian kid in front of him suddenly struggled. A trace of viciousness flashed in his eyes, and he pointed at the escape route that Lu Qin had pointed out to him. He opened his mouth and was about to speak loudly. Lu Qin's pupils suddenly shrank, and a cold intent flashed in his eyes. In that split second, he suddenly shook his hand. The barbarian kid's face suddenly stiffened, and all the words that he wanted to say were suddenly stuck in his throat, and he could no longer speak. A crisp sound of bones breaking rang out from his neck. There was a look of disbelief in his eyes, and he looked at Lu Qin, whose eyes had suddenly become cold. He didn't think that this soft-hearted person would suddenly become so cold and merciless. Then, his head slowly drooped down, and there was no more sound. Lu Qin slowly stood up, and turned around to look at the black-clothed man behind him. The black-clothed man nodded and said, "Well done." After that, he left the place and flew into the distance. Lu Qin looked at the black-clothed man as he left, and then looked at the barbarian kid who had already fallen on the ground. His eyes were indifferent. After a while, he turned around and also left the place. The battle in the barbarian village was getting more and more intense, but in reality, they weren't evenly matched. To be exact, from the beginning, the barbarian tribe had basically fallen into a terrible situation. The strength of the black-clothed men who had suddenly appeared was too strong, and their methods were too cruel. They didn't give the barbarian tribe any chance. The situation in the village was tragic and bloody. Not long after, dozens of barbarians had already fallen, and the black-clothed men who had invaded were not even injured, let alone dead. The difference in strength between the two sides was too big, and the scene was chaotic. Under the cover of this chaos, Lu Qin approached the pile of stones without anyone noticing. The strange black piece of wood was inserted on top of the pile of stones, and it was about 5 or 6 feet high. Lu Qin's eyes swept over it and suddenly froze. He stopped at a certain place below the pile of stones for a moment. Somewhere in the pile of stones, there were a few white things. Lu Qin's eyes instantly became cold, and his eyes were full of killing intent. The white things were the color of bones, and there were a few round things in the pile of stones. They looked like human skulls, and the black holes of the skulls looked gloomy and terrifying. But what was more frightening was that Lu Qin could clearly see some broken bite marks on 1 or 2 of the bones, as if they had been gnawed on by wild beasts. His body suddenly trembled, and even his breathing became hurried. After a while, he forced himself to look away and clenched his teeth. He controlled his mind and took a deep breath, and then walked towards the black piece of wood. But right in front of his eyes, a hand suddenly reached out from the side and snatched the black piece of wood away in an instant. Lu Qin was shocked. He looked up and saw that it was the old barbarian priest. His old face was filled with madness, and he grabbed the black piece of wood and leaned it against his body. Suddenly, the totem symbols on the black piece of wood that had dimmed after the ceremony was interrupted suddenly lit up, and a strange aura emitted from the black piece of wood. The old barbarian priest's eyes were bloodshot, and he shouted a few incomprehensible words from his mouth. It seemed like he was chanting something like an incantation. Strands of red aura floated up from the black piece of wood, and immediately rushed towards the barbarians who were still alive in the surroundings. The scene was as if there were hundreds of red lines suddenly connecting all the barbarians to the black piece of wood in a way that would make one's scalp tingle. Every red line was tied to the head of a barbarian, and then, following the old priest's hoarse howl, a strange change occurred. All the barbarians, regardless of whether they were old or young, had their bodies inflated like a balloon. Their faces were ferocious, and their eyes were bulging out. Their ugly faces now looked like those of evil spirits. But at the same time, the strength of these barbarians seemed to have doubled, especially the strongest of the barbarians. Their bodies had doubled in size, and in a short period of time, they seemed to be suppressing the black-robed men who were charging towards them. Such a strange secret technique was unbelievable. But soon, Everyone realized that this secret technique wasn't a very comfortable thing to do. Because suddenly, someone let out a blood-curdling scream in front of everyone's eyes. A barbarian woman's swollen body exploded and instantly turned into powder. Blood flowed like a river. But even more barbarians seemed to have gone mad and rushed towards the black-robed men. An even more horrifying battle had begun. Chapter 269. The situation of the battle became more and more tragic. Flesh and blood flew everywhere in the village. It had completely turned into a hellish place. The black-robed men who had the upper hand suddenly suffered a setback. In this sudden counterattack, the barbarian villagers who had suddenly turned crazy and violent gave them an unexpected blow. Caught off guard, these black-robed men retreated again and again. Some of them were even wounded. This scene was obviously out of everyone's expectation. A series of angry roars sounded from the black-robed men everywhere. The situation became a little chaotic. However, these black-robed men were not a motley crew after all. Apart from their valiant combat strength, there were also some who had sharp eyes and sharp eyes. Soon, someone saw the key point and shouted, "It's that old man. Quickly kill that old thing." As soon as the shout came out, the black-robed men immediately came to their senses. For a moment, their swords shone brightly, and sharp whistling sounds were heard. They all wanted to kill the old priest. At this moment, the old priest was still standing beside the pile of rocks. His eyes were bloodshot, and even his pupils were covered to the point that they could not be seen. A few drops of dark red blood flowed down from the corner of his eyes. It looked extremely strange and especially mournful. The black piece of wood on his chest was still emitting countless red lines, connecting all the barbarians in the village. Under the urging of the mysterious incantation, the barbarians roared like wild beasts and madly pounced towards the black-robed men. Wuxia was the one who was originally the closest to the pile of stones. When he saw that the strange black piece of wood was within his reach, it was suddenly snatched away by the old priest. Then this horrifying scene happened. Almost without giving him any chance to react, Wuxia suddenly found that he had suddenly fallen into a tight encirclement. There were barbarians almost everywhere around him. And at this moment, those barbarians who had already fallen into madness, regardless of gender or age, were all pouncing towards him. Wuxia felt a pressure as heavy as a mountain. It was as if he had fallen into the illusion of a group of demonic beasts. He made a prompt decision and immediately turned to run. These barbarians seemed to be slightly stronger than ordinary human beings, but they were still much weaker than human cultivators. However, it was unknown what strange technique the old shaman had used through the black totem. In just a split second, the red thread had caused the bodies of these barbarians to explode. They had become so powerful that they could fight against the cultivators. Fortunately, Wuxia was agile, and these barbarians hadn't completely adapted to the sudden increase in strength. Although they were fierce and unafraid of death, they weren't very agile when it came to advancing and retreating. Therefore, after a while, Wuxia was really lucky enough to escape from the barbarians. After running back to the forest, Wuxia looked back and saw that the barbarians did not chase after him. At most, they chased him to the edge of the village, and then they turned back and rushed towards the remaining black-robed men. Wuxia panted for a while. Suddenly, there was a rustling sound in the forest next to him. He was shocked and took a step back. After a while, the leaves of the forest were pushed aside, and it was Atsu who jumped out. Wuxia breathed a sigh of relief and nodded to Atsu. Atsu looked at him with some worry in his eyes. He looked at Wuxia, then looked at the chaotic and bloody village at the foot of the mountain, and let out a low roar. Wuxia also frowned. He stood next to Atsu and looked down. Then, he said softly, "The situation doesn't seem right, it's too strange." At this moment, the situation in the barbarian village was indeed getting more and more strange. The barbarians seemed to have gone completely crazy. They rushed forward and fought with the black-robed men. They bit, kicked, and smashed them. They did everything they could. Even if they were injured by the black-robed men's weapons, or had their fingers or arms chopped off, these barbarians did not seem to feel any pain. They still roared and rushed towards their enemies. The black-robed men who wanted to rush and kill the old priest found that they were not only blocked by these crazy barbarians, but were also gradually forced to retreat. They were getting further and further away from the old priest. This was originally a one-sided battle, but the barbarians had turned the tables. The scales of victory and defeat were about to be reversed. But right at this moment, someone suddenly sneered from within the crowd, and then someone suddenly flew up and flashed into midair. After a long howl, sword light rose explosively, and it shockingly transformed into a myriad of azure sword lights that slashed down with an imposing manner. In an instant, there was a loud bang on the ground. 3 or 4 barbarians bore the brunt of the attack and fell to the ground. Blood sprayed out like a fountain. It was Qianji Xianqing's sword. In the air, the black-robed man shouted in a deep voice, "Gather!" His voice was like the sound of thunder rumbling out. After a moment, all the black-robed men simultaneously gathered towards his side. Along the way, they supported each other. 1 merged into 2, 2 merged into 3. The black-robed men quickly changed from their original scattered state to a situation where they gathered together. At the same time, as the black-robed man in the air continued to shout out orders, the black-robed men stood in their respective positions and quickly formed a battle formation. With this, the situation immediately changed. The black-robed men quickly stabilized their footing. Under the battle formation, they no longer had to worry about the threat behind them. They focused on the outside and soon blocked those crazy barbarians. In the distance, Lu Qin, who was standing on the mountainside and watching from afar, his face tightened. His eyes revealed a somewhat dignified look. He said in a low voice, "Powerful." Atsu raised his head and looked at him. He seemed to be somewhat puzzled. In this battle of life and death, the black-robed assassins of the human race were originally the party with the highest cultivation. They had an overwhelming advantage over the barbarians. Although no one knew what kind of strange magic the old shaman had used during this period of time and caused the battle to reverse, but after the black-robed men formed their formation, once they stabilized their footing, the situation immediately became clear. No matter how ferocious and crazy the barbarians were, and how fearless they could not force the black-robed men to take a step back. Instead, under the various kinds of sharp sword lights, blood flowed like a tide. One by one, the barbarians began to fall to the ground and die. The situation, in the end, did not deviate from the normal range. The strange magic of these barbarians, in the end, did not go against the natural order. The old shaman held the black wooden block in his arms. His face was ferocious, and his eyes were bleeding. But a trace of despair and sorrow finally appeared on his face. He suddenly let out a desolate roar, as if with the last of his life force. A mouthful of blood sprayed from his mouth and directly onto the black wooden block. The dark totem suddenly shone brightly, and a strong and strange force descended from the sky, crashing down and shrouding the village. On the mountainside, Lu Chen's body suddenly shook. He staggered and fell to the ground. From his body, at this moment, black flames suddenly burst out and directly turned him into a flaming man. Chapter 270. No one knew where that powerful, ruthless, and boundless dark power came from. It was as if it had suddenly broken through space and crossed the long river of time. The originally bright sky suddenly darkened. Darkness swept across the sky and shrouded the tiny village. A wisp of flame appeared on the black piece of wood. A low sound was heard. It was the sound of the black wood cracking. The old barbarian priest's body was trembling. It was as if he had fallen into hell and was suffering endless pain. At the same time, on the hillside outside the village, Lu Chen slowly climbed up from the ground. The black fire was shrinking back from his flesh and skin. He had lost control for a moment, but he quickly regained control of the black fire in his body. However, his eyes were looking at the village from afar. He was staring at the old priest. The corner of his eyes twitched. At that moment, perhaps no one in the world could feel the pain more than him. It was the ultimate pain of the black fire burning one's body and soul. It was almost beyond the limit of what a human could endure. He had been trapped in it for 10 years. Under the illumination of the black fire, the terrifying and strange force entered the old priest's body through the black wood totem. His old body slowly swelled up like an inflated balloon. The countless red lines that spread from the black wooden block in the air also slowly turned black. The barbarians who were fighting fearlessly suddenly stopped. When the black-clothed men saw this extremely creepy scene, they couldn't help but stop and look at each other. Many of them even had the intention to retreat in their eyes. Who would have thought that this small barbarian tribe would have so many tricks up their sleeves? They thought that it would be a piece of cake. A hoarse shout came from the old priest's mouth. This shout was like an order. All the barbarians who were in a daze suddenly moved. But this time, they did not fight. They did not bite or bite. Instead, they pounced towards the men in black. The sharp light of the sword flew up and slashed fiercely. For a moment, blood splattered everywhere. But the barbarians did not care. They did not care about life and death. Even if their limbs were broken, they still charged forward bravely until they reached the men in black. Pow! A soft sound rang out from the old shaman's bulging body. A bloody hole suddenly burst open on his back. That piece of flesh instantly turned into tiny pieces of blood that splattered everywhere. And almost at the same time, a barbarian who had pounced in front of one of the men in black suddenly exploded. He had lost one of his arms. Like a terrible firework, he exploded. His flesh, blood, bones, life, and soul were instantly stimulated. The power was so great that a scream was heard. Half of the man in black who was closest to the explosion was blown away. He was flung several feet away. Then he fell to the ground and twitched. It seemed that he would not be able to live. Everyone turned pale with fright. However, everything seemed to have gone completely out of control. The terrifying power of darkness shrouded this seemingly cursed death village. On the body of the old priest, bloody holes exploded one after another. What followed after was the same explosion, and then the barbarians who wanted to perish together with the black-robed men. This was an exceptionally terrifying and despair-inducing battle. In the end, there was no victor. There was only death. The flesh and blood of the barbarians were completely stimulated by the terrible power. The men in black couldn't resist the powerful barbarians' bombs. The originally strong battle formation quickly collapsed. Finally, everyone turned around and fled. But it was useless. The barbarians lunged forward crazily as if they had all lost their minds. The number of barbarians far exceeded the number of men in black. They swarmed from all directions and perished together with the barbarians. The rumbling sound did not stop. The whole village had turned into hell. All lives were turned into nothingness in the terrible black flame. Pieces of flesh and blood fell to the ground. In front of such a terrible witchcraft, any magic, divine power, immortal sword, or magic weapon seemed to be overshadowed. But what people didn't expect was that this terrible situation lasted for a long time. It was like thunder. Not only this mountain, but for the next few decades, there were no longer any animals within a radius of several hundred miles. All the living creatures, including the demonic beasts and poisonous creatures, and even the poisonous insects in the evil Python Valley, had all fled. Everything turned into silence in the darkness. It was not until the sun reappeared and the darkness slowly receded that the village was revealed from the darkness. There was a suffocating smell of blood in the air. Looking from afar, it seemed as if there were no living people left. To be exact, perhaps there was no one left. On the hillside outside the village, Lu Chen and Atsu were stunned by this scene. They were speechless for a long time. It was the first time in Lu Chen's life that he had seen such a tragic scene. At this moment, Lu Chen's mind was also blank. After a long time, he slowly regained his composure. He looked at the village below and struggled for a moment. Then he lowered his head and said to Atsu, "You stay here, don't go over." Atsu nodded obediently and took 2 steps back. It seemed that he had no choice but to go over. Lu Chen sighed, turned around and walked down the hill. He hadn't even walked into the village when the dense smell of blood caused Lu Chen to have no choice but to hold his breath, whereas after he entered the village, the scene of a slaughterhouse of blood and flesh almost caused someone with a heart of stone like him to be unable to endure it. As far as the eye could see, there were almost no complete bodies left. Even those who died the earliest had their corpses destroyed by the aftermath of the tragic self-destruction. Lu Chen's face was a little pale, but his rationality was still strong. After pausing for a moment, he found his target and walked over. At the center of the village, the old shaman was lying on the ground next to the pile of stones that had been dyed red with blood. The old barbarian's body had almost been completely blown up. Now, there was only a remnant of his body. The blackwood was still in front of his chest. At this moment, it had also been broken into pieces and was beyond recognition. Lu Chen looked at the blackwood in shock. He thought to himself, could it be that this thing was destroyed? He squatted down and was about to pick it up to take a closer look. Suddenly, the old shaman opened his eyes. Lu Chen was taken aback. But then, he realized that the eyes of the barbarian priest had returned to normal. They were no longer blood-red in color. Instead, his eyes looked exactly like a human's, and he was staring at Lu Chen. An inexplicable heartbeat suddenly sounded in Lu Chen's ears. The power of the black fire suddenly became restless. A strange black light flashed in the deepest part of his eyes. The old shaman's lips moved. After a moment, a voice suddenly sounded in Lu Chen's ears. "Child, the god of fire has chosen you." Chapter 271. Child? God of Fire? What did he choose? At that moment, Lu Chen really thought that he was hallucinating. Could it be that there was some strange and unknown power in this ghostly place that could confuse one's mind and heart? However, the next moment he looked into the eyes of the dying old priest and suddenly realized that this matter did not seem to be a joke. Although the old priest's eyes were a little dim, but he had been staring at him, not letting go. In that gaze, there was surprise, sadness, anger, but more than that, there was joy and hope. Yes, the eyes of this old man who was about to die were actually filled with hope. His cracked lips moved, but no sound came out. Not even a hoarse whimper could be heard. Lu Chen's gaze shifted downwards, and then he frowned slightly. This was because below the old priest's head, his chest and torso were almost completely blown up. Even his neck was a mess of flesh and blood. It looked extremely tragic, and basically, it was impossible for him to make any sound. As expected, I have been soft-hearted recently, and thus I am hallucinating. Lu Chen sighed in his heart, shook his head, and stretched out his hand towards the old priest's eyes, intending to close his eyes. However, at this moment, suddenly, another voice called out in his ear, "Child." Lu Chen's hand instantly stiffened, and then he slowly stepped back, once again avoiding the old priest's gaze. The old priest was now staring at Lu Chen. Lu Chen had encountered many strange things in his life, but at this moment he still felt a chill in his heart. He stared at the old shaman's eyes that seemed to be on the verge of death but refused to die. He asked in a low voice, "You called me?" The old priest's eyes slowly closed, and then opened again. Lu Chen's pupils abruptly shrank, his eyes flashed and suddenly looked down, sweeping across the remains of the old priest. After a moment, he suddenly stretched out his hand and with a crashing sound, the piece of black wood that was originally on the old priest's chest but had already broken into pieces, suddenly turned into a dozen pieces of wood and fell down, at the same time revealing another half of an old wooden staff that was originally hidden in the black wood. It looked like a very ancient wooden staff. For some reason, one end was broken, and the remaining half was covered in cracks. The wood was like ancient bronze, as if it had experienced millions of years of erosion. The only arm of the old priest that was still in good condition was tightly gripping the wooden staff. A faintly discernible and extremely weak spiritual power seemed to be emanating from the wooden staff. Lu Chen fell silent. After a while, he shifted his gaze away from the ancient wooden staff and looked at the old priest again. The old priest was also looking at him. His gaze was still complicated, but it was clearly filled with hope. Lu Chen suddenly shook his head and said, "Are you confused?" The old priest did not speak, or perhaps he could not speak at all. He only stared blankly at Lu Chen. But at the same time, that voice suddenly sounded in Lu Chen's ears, "The god of fire chose. What is the god of fire?" Lu Chen's face was cold. "I don't know what god is this, and I don't believe that there is a god in this world. You have the holy fire, "You are the son of the god of fire." That voice seemed to completely ignore his response. It still spoke in an indifferent and flat tone. Lu Chen was about to refute, but suddenly realized that the other party did not seem to have any intention to argue with him. He was still talking to himself and said, "Take this fire staff, send it back to the southern wasteland holy altar, combine it with the other half of the staff, return god of fire." When it came to the last few words, there was an obvious tremor in the voice for the first time. It seemed that he was excited at this time. And at the same time, Lu Chen looked at the old priest's expression. His face was like a lamp that had run out of oil. Suddenly his muscles twitched. Lu Chen took a deep breath and shook his head. But suddenly he smiled. It was a bloody scene around him. At first glance, it seemed that he was the only one who was still in good condition. It was as if he was standing on top of a sea of blood. His eyes were filled with ridicule and self-mockery. "Your god of fire really knows how to find people," Lu Chen said. "First, he did not choose you barbarians. Second, even if he chose the human race, he chose a stray dog that could not be tolerated by the world, and could only flee to the ends of the earth. The god of fire's eyesight is not very good." Lu Chen looked at the dying old man and said. Then he emphasized the last few words. The light in the old priest's eyes gradually dimmed. Even his pupils were slowly enlarging. But after the half of the ancient wooden staff flashed slightly, the voice once again sounded in Lu Chen's ears. "Because of this, the god of fire chose you." Lu Chen's body trembled and suddenly froze. The old priest did not say anything more. After a moment, he quietly died. He stopped breathing and closed his eyes. Before he died, there was even a trace of a strange smile at the corner of his mouth. Lu Chen stared at the dead old barbarian. His eyes were a bit unkind. He always felt that there was a deep malice hidden in this old man's face, but the hope that was revealed before his death was particularly real. But what did the barbarian's hope and the old priest's expectations and dreams have to do with him? Lu Chen expressionlessly stood up. Just as he was about to leave, he immediately thought of something and his eyes once again fell on the old priest's corpse. The half of the ancient wooden staff was still tightly grasped in his hand. Lu Chen stared at the wooden staff for a while, but he still reached out to pick it up. Although the old priest was dead, his hand was still very firm on the wooden staff. Lu Chen also used a bit of strength to take the wooden staff out of his hand. But after holding it in his hand, or more accurately, after leaving the old priest's hand, the last bit of spirit force in the ancient wooden staff also disappeared. Without all of its spirit force, the wooden staff looked like an old, damaged, and mottled piece of wood. It was lifeless, withered, and cracked. Even if it was thrown on the side of the road, no one would take a second look. Lu Chen hesitated for a moment. He tried to input spirit force into the wooden staff, but the wooden staff did not respond. Lu Chen pondered for a moment and tried to use the black fire again, but he still did not see the scene he wanted. The ancient wooden staff also did not respond to the black fire. The reason why Lu Chen wanted this item was because he found that this wooden staff could actually resonate with the black fire in his body. Now that he had it in his hand, it suddenly became a waste. This made him feel a bit depressed. But at this time, he could not casually throw it away. In any case, from the old priest's words, this thing seemed to have a great origin. Chapter 272. Lu Chen turned around and walked back the way he came. Along the way, he turned his head to look at the place where the battle was the fiercest and cruelest. Those black-clothed men who were ambushed by the self-destructing barbarians and perished together with the barbarians didn't even have a single intact corpse. This unremarkable small tribe had inexplicably become the graveyard of dozens of extremely powerful cultivators. Perhaps no one would have thought of this outcome, even Lu Chen didn't think of this ending. However, even though the scene was extremely horrifying, Lu Chen didn't feel too guilty. Since a long time ago, when those black-clothed men were unwilling to let him go, the faintly discernible affection they had for each other in the past had already vanished into thin air. However, when he walked back to the mountain forest and occasionally turned his head to look into the distance, he suddenly discovered that along the way, there were already 2 additional bloody footprints on the path. It was a ghastly sight. Atsu was still waiting for him at the same place. After meeting up with them, Lu Chen thought for a moment and tried to place the wooden staff in front of Atsu. Atsu moved closer and sniffed a few times, then raised its head and looked at Lu Chen blankly. Obviously, it didn't find anything and didn't know what Lu Chen's intention was. Lu Chen sighed, shook his head and put away the wooden staff. He casually wiped his chest, and the wooden staff disappeared into thin air. This was the mysterious tree hole that he directly threw into the seed. When he had time in the future, he would carefully explore the secret of this wooden staff. However, perhaps this thing was already completely useless, Lu Chen thought in his heart. A man and a dog quickly left the mountain ridge. During this time, Lu Chen changed his clothes from head to toe. Because there were no longer these killers chasing after him, it was obvious that Lu Chen felt a lot more relaxed. This also made his mood a lot better. However, although those black-clothed men were almost all killed because of the accident, the uncomfortable feeling was still there. It was just that it wasn't as serious as before. After leaving the mountain ridge, Lu Chen hesitated, but in the end he still decided not to turn back. He still continued to flee south according to the route he had originally thought of. In this world, outside of the devil cult, there was almost no one who understood the madness of the devil cult better than him. Outside of the true immortal alliance, there was also almost no one who understood the strength of the floating cloud service better than him. Although those black-clothed men were powerful, even if they all died, it would not be a serious blow to the Floating Clouds office, a shadowy organization that perfected Lord Tianlon had single-handedly created. If they didn't have this kind of foundation, the Fuyun division wouldn't have been able to occupy the main hall of such a huge organization like the True Immortal Union for so many years, and also fight to the death with the Three Realms Devil Cult which had thousands of years of inheritance in the shadows. Lu Chen didn't want to fight against the terrifying power hidden in the shadows of Fuyunji. He also didn't have any thoughts of dying rather than surrendering. Therefore, he easily made the decision to continue fleeing. After making the decision, the next step was much easier. After all, it was only the word escape. The closest route was to pass through the Evil Python Valley at the foot of the mountain. If he continued heading south, he would almost reach the Longchuan River. After passing through the Longchuan, he would probably be able to truly escape from the damned and terrifying devil cult and Fuyunji's double pursuit. Lu Chen brought Atsu all the way down the mountain ridge. He didn't stop for long and walked towards the Evil Python Valley. From afar, a pungent stench wafted through the air. Atsu let out a low growl as the hair on his neck stood up. He looked extremely vigilant. Lu Chen also frowned. However, he still brought Atsu and stepped into the Evil Python Valley, which was filled with danger at every corner. The Evil Python Valley was actually a long and narrow valley sandwiched between several tall and majestic mountain ranges. Because of the tall mountains, this valley never saw the sun all year round. In addition, there was a lot of rain. So after a long time, this valley became extremely gloomy and humid. Under the thick green and moist leaves everywhere, countless snakes and poisonous creatures were bred. Among them, there were all kinds of poisonous snakes. After Lu Chen and Atsu walked into this valley, although it was daytime, the valley was still a little dim. They always felt that from the surrounding dense grass and trees, including the wet stone walls on both sides that were covered with moss and all kinds of strange plants, there would suddenly be some poisonous snakes and insects that would suddenly come out and bite them. Atsu looked very nervous, constantly looking left and right. Lu Chen also looked vigilant, looking to both sides from time to time. Sure enough, after they walked a few feet into the Evil Python Valley, suddenly, there was a sudden rustling sound from a bush. Lu Chen and Atsu immediately stopped in their tracks. After a while, they saw a big python with a body as big as a bowl slowly slithering out of the bush. Lu Chen's face changed slightly, and he took a step back. He was on high alert, and he also looked around to see if there were any poisonous snakes or insects hiding in the dark. As for Atsu, it let out a deep roar at the big python, revealing its two fangs, and made a ferocious face, as if it was going to pounce on the big python and tear it into pieces in the next moment. The greenish-black python slowly raised its head and glanced at Lu Chen and Atsu. Its vertical pupils were cold and merciless, and it flicked its forked tongue in and out as it faced the two of them. Atsu roared twice, and it was about to move forward, but it was suddenly stopped by Lu Chen. Lu Chen looked at the big python with rapt attention, and he said in a low voice, "Wait a minute." This big python seemed to have half of its body hidden in the bush, but just its upper body that was exposed was already big enough, and it was obviously an adult python. Lu Chen wasn't afraid of such a monster, but he was worried about something else. After all, this was the evil Python Valley, and it was unknown how many snakes and insects lived here. If they made a big noise, there was no telling how many snakes and insects would be attracted, and it would be really difficult to deal with them at that time. Sure enough, after Lu Chen stopped Atsu, which was showing hostility and was eager to attack, the big python didn't immediately launch an attack. It stared at Lu Chen for the last time, and suddenly turned its head, but it slithered away, and soon disappeared into the bush on the other side. Watching the big python leave, Lu Chen breathed a sigh of relief, and then he reached out his hand to pat Atsu's head, and said, "Let's go." At this time, Atsu looked a little disappointed, and it seemed to be a little dissatisfied with the big python leaving just now. It roared twice in that direction, and then continued to walk forward with Lu Chen. However, as they went deeper, they gradually discovered something strange. In this valley where poisonous insects gathered, it seemed that many poisonous insects had come out today, even though many of them should be hiding in their nests and sleeping at this time according to their habits. And what was even more strange was that these poisonous insects didn't have any intention to attack Lu Chen and Atsu. At most, they just confronted each other out of instinct, and after Lu Chen restrained himself and showed that he was not hostile, these originally bloodthirsty poisonous insects actually left this place one after another. Who would have thought that this originally dangerous path would be abnormally smooth for them? Chapter 273. The further they walked, the more eerie and frightening this damp and gloomy evil Python Valley became. However, strangely, not a single one of those poisonous snakes and insects that should be causing great trouble for Lu Chen and Atsu jumped out to attack them. Moreover, from what they could see, some of the snakes and insects that appeared abnormally left in the same direction, as if they had sensed that something bad was about to happen. The direction that they were escaping to was the direction that Lu Chen and Atsu had come from. Lu Chen could not help but turn his head to take a look. He only saw that the road behind him was completely quiet and he could not see anything strange. Moreover, he recalled that along the way he did not see anything that could affect the evil Python Valley. Moreover, it seemed like the impact was so great. Perhaps it was only something that happened in that barbarian tribe? No matter how Lu Chen pondered, the only possibility was the tragic massacre that occurred in the barbarian tribe not long ago. When he thought of this, a thought involuntarily came to his mind. He used his hand to touch his chest, where the ancient fire god's staff was quietly lying in that mysterious tree hole. After musing for a moment, Lu Chen called out to Atsu and quickened his pace. No matter how one put it, the situation in the evil Python Valley seemed a little strange. It was best to leave as soon as possible. Otherwise, even though those poisonous snakes and insects did not have any intention of attacking them, who could guarantee that those bloodthirsty and savage demonic beasts would not go berserk in the next moment? However, as they walked, Lu Chen could not help but shake his head as he thought about the journey over the past few days. He felt a little emotional. After escaping from the snake-overgrown forest, he had been fleeing south. Originally, he thought that the two most difficult and dangerous places along the way would be the Rat Hill Mountain and the evil Python Valley. Who knew that in the end, these two places seemed to be the easiest to pass through. On the other hand, his experience in that unassuming barbarian tribe on that small mountain was a soul-stirring experience. As he walked, Lu Chen's footsteps gradually slowed down. The feeling of being pricked appeared again, as if there was a pair of cold eyes staring at him from behind. Lu Chen's expression changed. Initially, he thought that this feeling was due to his keen intuition when he was being chased by the powerful Floating Clouds Division assassins. However, almost all of those assassins had died in the barbarian tribe on the small mountain ridge. In other words, the person who was spying on him in the dark was still following him like a maggot in his tarsal bone. What kind of enemy was this? A trace of solemnity flashed across Lu Chen's eyes. The terrain of the evil Python Valley was twisting and turning. Even if there were no dangerous snakes or insects obstructing the way, it would still take a day to walk. When they were halfway there, they saw all kinds of strange phenomena along the way. This made Lu Chen completely certain that the strange behavior of the snakes, insects and poisonous creatures in the evil Python Valley was indeed a mass migration. They were all leaving this dangerous valley that they had lived in for many years. This strange phenomenon became even more obvious when Lu Chen tried to take out the half of the fire god's staff. Almost all the snakes and insects immediately sped up and fled, as if they were especially afraid of the half of the fire god's staff, which looked so old and withered that it would soon turn into ashes. None of the poisonous creatures dared to go near Lu Chen and Atsu. This gave people the illusion that they were gods when they walked in this famous dangerous valley. However, this unexpected surprise did not last long. Because when Lu Chen and Atsu were about to walk out of the evil Python Valley, they were once again ambushed. This time, it was also a group of black-clothed men. However, what was different from the previous batch was that they were real evil cult assassins. Faced with Lu Chen, this new batch of assassins were clearly much more agitated. When they saw Lu Chen's figure, their murderous aura covered the sky and covered the earth. Without any unnecessary words, they directly charged over while shouting. Lu Chen and Atsu fought and retreated as they fled towards the south with all their might. At the same time, he laughed bitterly in his heart. According to his original plan, although it would be troublesome for him to pass through these two incomparably dangerous places, the Rat Hill Mountain and the evil Python Valley were more useful in hindering their pursuers. Who knew that with this series of strange changes, although the path was easier to walk, the pursuers' speed was much faster than expected. In terms of fighting ability, this batch of evil cult assassins was much weaker than the Fuyunji people before them. Their valiance was also far inferior. However, the evil cult side was more ferocious and crazy. Under the bone-deep hatred, once they found Lu Chen, it would be a fight to the death. This caused great trouble for Lu Chen's escape route. Along the way, when the sky darkened, Lu Chen led Atsu out of the evil Python Valley. Behind him, there were 7 to 8 corpses. However, his body, which had almost recovered, had many new wounds. Until late at night, under the cover of the darkness and a series of treacherous methods, Lu Chen finally managed to shake off those maniacal assassins. However, the road ahead was boundless and the night was deep. Lu Chen did not feel happy at all. He knew in his heart that after dawn the next day, those evil cult assassins would definitely continue to pursue him. And as time passed, the number of evil cult assassins who wanted to kill him would definitely increase. Until he exhausted all his energy and strength, that would be the time of his miserable death. Probably, they would not leave him with a whole corpse. Lu Chen thought to himself as he dragged his bleeding body and ran for his life in the darkness. Even a moment to catch his breath seemed like a luxury. Perhaps it was because he had seen too much blood these few days, or maybe it was because he had just fought for a long time. His injuries had numbed his brain. Right now Lu Chen's mind was somewhat blank. His only instinct was probably to get away from the threat behind him and run forward with all his might. His target was the Longchuan River. As long as he passed through there, he should be free. Or perhaps he would just die there. His original intuition turned from sharp to dull and then to numb, including the vigilance that had been hidden in his heart finally relaxed involuntarily. That late at night, Lu Chen finally paid the price. He saw a ray of light suddenly lit up from the darkness. That was a sword light. That sword light, bright and vigorous, full of vigor, full of spirit and energy, wonderful to the peak, a sword directly pierced the vital point. Before he could react, his flesh and blood had already split open, his bones were broken, directly pierced into the side of Lu Chen's ribs, a sword pierced into his chest, and he had no strength to evade. At that moment he suddenly understood, the most dangerous poisonous snake had never left, but had an appalling patience, waiting until he was at his weakest and then with one sword attack, wounded the enemy. Seeing that he was about to be pierced by the sword and die on the spot, suddenly, a black shadow rushed over from the side, made a furious roar and pounced on Lu Chen. However, the sword light was so intense that it didn't retreat at all. The remaining sword light swept past, and Atu's roar instantly turned into a mournful wail. Blood splattered everywhere, and he fell beside Lu Chen. Chapter 274. Lu Chen covered the wound under his ribs with his hand, but blood still gushed out from between his fingers. He gasped for breath and felt dizzy, but he quickly gritted his teeth to stay awake. He then turned his head and looked at Atsu. Atsu's body was stained with blood, and it was also injured. The sword light had cut its hind leg, and at the same time, it swept past its tail. However, compared to Lu Chen, Atsu's injury did not seem to be a big deal. It quickly stood up, bared its fangs at the place where the sword light came from, and let out an angry growl. A figure walked out from the darkness beside them. Then, with the help of the dim light, he and Lu Chen saw each other's faces clearly. "So it's you." Lu Chen covered his wound with his hand and said in surprise. The person who walked out from the darkness was the one who sneak attacked Lu Chen and almost killed him with a sword. It was the disciple of Kunlun. At this moment, he was dressed in a tight outfit and his face was calm. It seemed that the steady, accurate, and almost perfect sword attack just now was not something to be happy about. However, when he glanced at Atsu, who was baring its fangs and looking fierce, his eyes showed a trace of surprise and admiration. "This dog is not bad," he said. Lu Chen coughed a few times, and only felt that there was a burst of cold in his body. It was probably because too much blood had flowed from the wound under his ribs, and the heat in his body had been taken away. He raised his head and looked at He. He did not scold him, nor did he beg for mercy. Instead, he asked, "When did you target me?" He also didn't seem to have any intention of making a move immediately. It was just that it was unknown whether he was toying with Lu Chen like a cat chasing a mouse, or whether he was actually somewhat fearful of this person. He said, "It's been many days. In fact, when you were at the snake forest, I had already found you." Lu Chen nodded, thinking that his intuition would not lie to him. He stared at him and suddenly asked, "Who exactly are you?" Lu Chen sneered and said, "You've chased me for so long and spent so much effort, yet you still don't know who I am? Even if I were to die, it would be too unjust." He shook his head and said, "At first I thought you are only a devil cult evildoer who sneaked into our Kunlun party to be a spy. No matter how high your position is, no matter how deep your cultivation is, I will think of a way to kill you. When I return, I will be able to give an explanation to Tianlon Jinjuan, the senior, and that will be enough. But along the way I realized, give Tianlon an explanation?" Lu Chen suddenly interrupted him. His expression suddenly turned cold and strange. "What explanation? Did he send you here to kill me?" Thousands of mountains and rivers away, in the towering Kunlun mountain that had changed from its old appearance to a new one, everything seemed very calm. But under the calmness, it seemed that everything was changing rapidly. Of the 4 famous and world-famous floating peaks in the forbidden area among the clouds in the sky, there were now only 3 left, and the winter peak had become a ruin in the mountain range below. The person who presided over the daily affairs of the Kunlun party changed from Immortal Idol Month to Immortal Qiandeng. Although there was a temporary, in front of his title, as Immortal Idol Month quietly fell silent in the closed-door training, everyone in the Kunlun party knew that the person sitting on the throne would eventually be the real owner of that throne. Many changes had taken place in the major halls of the Kunlun party. The most important change was, of course, the change of the chief of some powerful halls. Among them, everyone expected that the chief of Baichao Tang would change from Immortal Qiandeng to Immortal Mingzhu. But no one expected that the chief of Heavenly Soldier Hall, after Dukan Jinren accidentally died in the battle with the demon beast, did not choose a successor from Heavenly Soldier Hall, nor did he let Dukan Jinren's favorite disciple He take over. Instead, he sent an equally powerful Immortal Guangyang to take over. At the same time, the Iron Branch of the Kunlun party, which had always been weak, began to rise with Masato Kihara's appropriate choice. As everyone knew, the only person in the Kunlun party, Immortal Tianlon, valued Masato Kihara very much. For the first time in many years, he allowed him and a few other Iron Branch Yuanying Zenrins to ascend the mountain among the clouds in the sky. In addition to these obvious personnel changes, there were also some faint undercurrents surging in the Kunlun party. After firmly taking control of this famous sect, Immortal Tianlan began to reorganize the sect through his subordinates. Some powerful Yuanying Zenrins, many outstanding and talented disciples in the Jindan realm and the foundation-building realm were selected. They were then told that they would receive an opportunity that they had never had before to go to Zhengxianmeng to work. In the past, although Immortal Tianlan himself held a high position in Zhengxianmeng, the Kunlun party was different from the other famous sects, such as Qianji and Tianluo. They did not have the intention to be very close to or value Zhengxianmeng. Their disciples also rarely went to Zhengxianmeng to work, which formed a sharp contrast with the other big sections. The root of this was, of course, because in the past, Hakushin Jinkuan and Zhenren Idol Month were in power. If they sent people to Zhengxianmeng to work, wouldn't they be helping Immortal Tianlan? Now that the situation had changed greatly, it naturally could not be mentioned in the same breath as before. But now, although his words carried enormous weight in the Kunlun mountain, Immortal Tianlan didn't seem to have any desire to covet power. He didn't interfere with most of the sect's affairs and let Qiandeng Zhenren handle them himself. Under normal circumstances, he mostly stayed on the summer peak in the sky. It was rare for ordinary disciples to see him, but perhaps it was because of this detached feeling that people respected him even more. In addition, there were always people who intentionally or unintentionally added fuel to the fire in the sect. Very soon, Immortal Tianlan had a lofty, godlike status in the hearts of the numerous ordinary disciples of the Kunlun party. As for what the truth was, it actually wasn't important. One day, Tianlan once again appeared in the Black Hill Pavilion in Kunwa City. Old Ma, who was guarding this deserted and run-down shop, originally thought that this lord had some secret business or some secret person to meet here. But to his great surprise, Immortal Tianlan told him to close the door, saying that he only had something to say to him. Standing in the quiet small courtyard and looking at the tall and fat-bald Immortal Tianlan, Old Ma subconsciously became a little nervous. He slightly lowered his head to look at the ground in front of him and suddenly remembered that every time this person came, Lu Chen was always the one facing him. So, every time this person came, did Lu Chen also have this kind of apprehension in his heart? Immortal Tianlan didn't carefully observe Old Ma. After calling Old Ma over, he very directly said to him, "Pack your luggage and go to the Immortal City for me." He looked a little unhappy and even a little disgusted. Something probably happened in Fuyunji. Chapter 275. What's wrong? Old Ma was taken aback. A look of surprise appeared on his face as he asked, "What happened at the Floating Clouds Company?" Perfected Lord Tianlan snorted coldly. Shui Ying sent a message saying that after she returned to the Immortal City, the people who went to the Land of Chaos have yet to return. Old Ma shuddered. "I remember that when Shui Ying came that day, she was here. You personally told her to bring everyone back." Perfected Lord Tianlan did not speak and only looked at him indifferently. Old Ma suddenly felt a chill in his heart. "You're suspicious of Shui Ying?" Perfected Lord Tianlan frowned slightly. After a moment of silence, he said, "Not really. She's been doing well all these years and has not made any mistakes. However, this concerns Lu Chen's life and death. I believe you're the only one who wouldn't lie to me about this." Old Ma nodded silently. However, a hint of worry quickly appeared on his face. "If those people don't return from the Land of Chaos," Perfected Lord Tianlan said coldly, "Shui Ying sent those people over to track and monitor Lu Chen. If they don't return, there are only two reasons. 1. Something happened to those people and they were all wiped out. 2. The order they received was not to return to the city but to hunt down Lu Chen." He looked up at Old Ma and said indifferently, "Go to the Immortal City and investigate this matter in Fuyunji with my token. No matter what the reason is, whether it's not returning to the city or hunting down Lu Chen, they've disobeyed my orders. Since they dared to do this, someone has to bear the responsibility." With that, he casually waved his hand, and a round object flew over. Old Ma stretched out his hands to catch it. He looked at it carefully and saw that it was a white jade plate with 2 sides. The front side was engraved with the words, Tianlan, and the back side was a picture of the rising sun decorated with cloud bat patterns. Old Ma took a deep breath and held the white jade token tightly in his hand. Then he bowed to Perfected Lord Tianlan and said, "Don't worry, I'll definitely do this well." Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded silently. After a while, he suddenly looked up at the sky with a complicated and slightly bleak expression on his face. He said, "Although that kid and I are not master and disciple, and he often speaks disrespectfully to me, no one can kill him without my permission." A trace of excitement flashed across the depths of Old Ma's eyes. He bowed and said, "Yes, I understand." "Go ahead." Perfected Lord Tianlan waved his hand and closed his eyes. "Who sent me here to kill you? Is it important?" He held the sword that was dripping with blood and stood a few feet away from the seriously injured Lu Qin. He looked at this enemy with interest and said, "What I'm curious about is why you suddenly asked such a question?" He smiled and gestured to the sky with his hand. Then he said calmly, "The Perfected Lord Tianlan we're talking about is a person of virtue and prestige. He's famous in the world. He's like an immortal. Not to mention a lowly devil cult evildoer like you, even a Jindan stage cultivator like me, who is regarded as a genius by others, may not be worthy of his attention." But when you said that, He's gaze fell on Lu Chen's face. "When you said that just now, it seemed like it was natural that Perfected Lord Tianlan would come to deal with you. Isn't that strange?" Lu Chen covered his wound with his hand and frowned. It was unknown whether it was because of the sharp pain or because he had lost too much blood, but he shut his mouth and did not speak anymore. "So, I'm very curious. What kind of person are you?" He looked at him and said, "An ordinary devil sect spy should not have any relationship with a Perfected Lord Tianlan. Furthermore, I discovered another strange thing along the way. There were actually people from the Floating Clouds agency chasing after you. It would appear that your background is much greater than I had imagined." Lu Chen coughed painfully. He looked at He and suddenly smiled. "Trying to get information from me?" He shrugged his shoulders. "I think we're both smart people. There's no need to talk nonsense. Tell me clearly and I'll give you a quick death. Isn't that convenient for both of us?" Lu Chen sneered. "Since you've been following behind, you must have seen what happened to Fuyunji people. At that kind of critical moment, you're a righteous disciple. Why didn't you go and save them?" Yi's expression changed slightly. He shook his head and said, "I did see it. But my ability is limited. I can't save them. Besides, Fuyunji people are still hiding behind them. They're still hiding and not going to save them. Why should I be a busybody?" Lu Chen was surprised. "There are still people alive in Fuyunji?" He thought for a moment. "There's 1 or 2 people. They didn't even enter the village. Of course they're fine." As he spoke, he waved his hand, looking like he did not want to continue this topic. He said, "But this has nothing to do with me. What I am most interested in is that a few days ago in the snake-overgrown forest, these Floating Clouds Division people had clearly caught up to you, the evil cult spy, but in the end, not only did they not swarm you, they even hid their heads and tails and pretended to be evil cult killers to kill you. These things are getting weirder and weirder. I'm more and more curious about your identity. How about it? Tell me?" He smiled at Lu Chen. The long sword in his hand stretched out towards him. It was also at this moment that Lu Chen's gaze, which had been staring at He, suddenly flashed with a hint of mockery. He said, "After talking for so long, I think I understand." He didn't like the look in Lu Chen's eyes at the moment, but his self-restraint and patience were far better than that of ordinary people. It was precisely this kind of temperament that allowed him to keep climbing up in the Kunlun sect, from an ordinary disciple with no background to the position where he was about to make a name for himself today. Only one last step left. As long as he could get that Tianlan True Lord's appreciation, as long as he could become his disciple and obtain the Tian Character Taoist title, his future path would be a broad path to immortality. Looking at the world, who could be compared with him? Therefore he was exceptionally patient. Even more patient than usual. Anyway, this Lu Chen was already seriously injured and had almost no strength to fight back. What was there for him to be afraid of? What did you understand? He smiled and said. Then that sword stretched forward a few inches. The blade flashed with cold light. This time it was aimed at Lu Chen's throat. As long as he thrust forward, Lu Chen would die here and now. Lu Chen, on the other hand, had a calm expression on his face. He looked at Yi with a smile and asked, "How is your younger brother now?" Yi's body suddenly shook. His eyes suddenly burst with light. But at this moment when he was distracted, he suddenly saw Lu Chen raise his palm slightly. A strange black fog suddenly floated up. Yi's eyes were suddenly filled with darkness. There was no longer any light. Chapter 276. Nowadays, the evil sect, which was regarded as a scourge by the world, was actually called the Holy Sect of the Three Realms. Some of the smaller sects did not know much about the history of their ancestors and mistakenly called it the Holy Sect of the Three Realms. According to the ancient books and textual research passed down by the evil sect, the so-called three realms corresponded to heaven, earth, and man, referring to the three realms of immortal, man, and ghost. But what was the truth and whether there was any basis for this statement, there were different opinions. The people of the evil sect firmly believed in this and took it as their highest goal to welcome the true God to descend to the world and unify the three realms. But the people of the righteous often scoffed at this because in history, other than those illusory ancient myths, there had never been any evidence to prove the existence of the immortal realm and ghost realm. And in order to break the boundaries and invite the true God, the followers of the holy sect of the three realms often indulged in all kinds of unimaginable and exaggerated actions that crossed the boundaries. Moving mountains and filling the seas were all small matters, and there were many cases of people being plunged into misery and suffering. This was what the people of the righteous couldn't tolerate. Even if they didn't talk about the principles of enforcing justice on behalf of heaven, if your sect messed around and caused the world to be in chaos, causing mountains to collapse and the earth to crack and causing heavy casualties, then how could the people of the righteous live? So, the world rose up and attacked them. The holy sect of the three realms was also a powerful sect. If there was a disagreement, they would start fighting. Even if they were to become enemies with the whole world, they wouldn't even bat an eye. Perhaps in the hearts of those fanatical believers, this was also the training of the true God? But faith was faith. No matter how fanatical and powerful you were, you definitely couldn't beat everyone in the world who was angry and resentful. So the result of the continuous war was that the holy sect became the evil sect and became a street rat that everyone wanted to beat up. In order to survive, the evil sect had to keep up with the times and kept a low profile for many years. Then there were many evil and crooked things. Then, following the long and seemingly endless battle with the righteous, these strange and evil techniques became more and more powerful. When Lu Chen was in the evil sect, because of his noble and important status, he knew a lot of secrets and learned a lot of such sinister and evil skills. In fact, he had occasionally wondered if he was really born to do bad things. Otherwise, how could he learn all these crooked things so easily? For example, many years later today, the ink sand he used on He was one of the most sinister methods of the devil cult. The black mist had appeared out of nowhere with a menacing momentum, instantly blocking He's path. He was shocked and instinctively took a step back, but he immediately came to his senses. With an angry roar, he stabbed forward with his sword, wanting to stab Lu Chen to death, who had suddenly launched a sneak attack. However, the sword missed. Presumably, after creating the black fog, Lu Chen directly flipped over and left. He was just about to make a move to leave the black fog and see where Lu Chen was. But suddenly, his eyes felt a sudden pain and tears involuntarily flowed down. At the same time, his eyes seemed to be stabbed by a knife. For a moment, he was in unbearable pain. He was shocked. His heart was shaken. The eyes were an important part of the body and extremely weak. Even if Jean Dan Fryer had tempered his body, the eyes were also one of the weakest parts. He did not dare to hesitate and retreated a few steps. At the same time, he closed his eyes and shook his left sleeve to disperse the fog. The spiritual sword in his right hand swept in front of him, guarding against Lu Chen's sneak attack. But he obviously thought too much. Lu Chen did not have the intention to hit him when he was down. A series of low growls were heard. He hugged Atsu, and one man and one dog immediately fled. He cursed and retreated a few steps back. At this moment, there was no more black fog around his eyes. He immediately sat down and circulated his power to expel the poison. After all, he was the powerful Jin Dan friar. He Yi's body was already far stronger than ordinary people. The black fog's poisonous gas could not cause too much harm to him. In fact, this was only an insidious little trick of the evil sect. It might be effective against ordinary cultivators, but against experts above the level of Jin Dan, it could only be used to disgust them. After about half a moment, he jumped up. But on his originally handsome face, there were more than a dozen black spots around his eyes. He looked really scary. He was caught off guard and actually fell for such a sinister little trick. It really made him unable to restrain his anger. He let out an angry roar that soared into the sky. He was unwilling to let the matter rest and directly chased into the distance. That night, he caught up with Lu Chen several times. But every time, Lu Chen would use some kind of more insidious tricks and spells. Some of them were really unimaginable and made he suffer a few times. But he soon discovered that these seemingly frightening and insidious tricks actually had limited effect on him. Under the protection of the powerful Jin Dan realm's spiritual power, he only suffered some flesh wounds at most. But even so, as the number of times he suffered losses increased, he also became angrier. He hated Lu Chen more and more, and his attacks became fiercer and fiercer. However, every time when he caught up with Lu Chen, he would restrain himself from killing him in the middle of each fight. Because he wanted to capture this evil cult spy with an unusually mysterious background and interrogate him properly to find out what secrets he had and what relationship he had with true Lord Tianlan. And most importantly, why did he suddenly mention He Gang? Could it be that his brother's death had something to do with this person? Thinking of this, he felt as if his internal organs were on fire and his eyes were about to spit fire. Lu Chen and Atsu fled with all their might. But they were seriously injured, and Yi was a man with a solid foundation. The distance between them was getting shorter and shorter, and Lu Chen's escape methods were almost exhausted. Then, at a certain moment, they and Yi, who was chasing closely behind, suddenly heard a deep and vigorous sound of water. It was as if a giant dragon was roaring in front of them, striding across the vast wilderness of the chaotic land. Dragon River. Dragon River. The boundary river that separated the dangerous and unpredictable central region of the chaotic land from the outer region. After struggling for a long time, Lu Chen, who was exhausted, could only helplessly lie on Atsu's back and let it charge forward. Speaking of which, Atsu's endurance and speed were on full display during this escape. It was terrifying to the point that it did not seem tired at all. The only reason why Lu Chen was able to survive until now, other than those little tricks that were becoming less effective, was because of Atsu. But at this moment, when the sound of water grew louder and louder, Atsu suddenly stomped on the ground and stopped in its tracks. Its momentum was so strong that it almost threw Lu Chen off its back. Lu Chen raised his head tiredly and his expression changed slightly. He didn't know when, but they had actually run to the top of a cliff. Below their feet was a precipice that was several hundred feet high, and below them was the Dragon Creek River. They had escaped into a hopeless situation. Just as Atsu was about to turn around, they heard a long laugh. A figure descended from the sky and blocked their only way out. It was He, whose eyes were filled with strange black dots. He stood in front of them with a sword in his hand and looked at them with a murderous look. Chapter 277. The Dragon River was a large river. It could even be said to be the largest river in the chaotic lands. The river was so wide that one couldn't see the end of it, almost like the ocean. At the same time, it was also the most famous river in the chaotic lands, because it was the dividing line between the central and outer regions of the chaotic lands. The Dragon River was also an extremely dangerous river. Within the wide river hid countless unimaginable, ferocious and powerful monsters, forming a natural dividing line. Other than the Yuanying realm cultivators of the human race, Jean Dan Friar would often find it difficult to cross this river. Once he crossed the Dragon River and continued south, the dangers in the central region of the chaotic lands would only increase. With Jean Dan Friar's cultivation level, even if he didn't die, he would at least lose more than he would gain. As for those below the Jean Dan realm, they would immediately give up. Over time, the Dragon Creek River became the publicly recognized dividing line and became one of the most dangerous places in the Land of Chaos. However, nothing was absolute. Although the Dragon River was dangerous, it wasn't completely impossible to cross. For example, the barbarians in the chaotic lands had tried to cross the Dragon River. The evil sect had been suppressed by the righteous Tao for many years and had to hide. There were also many people in the chaotic lands. After a long time, they learned some secrets, including how to cross the Dragon River. Although the method was a little dangerous, it was indeed a method. Lu Chen was aware of this in his heart. However, this method was definitely not to fall from this cliff that was several hundred feet high. There were basically two consequences for doing so: falling to death or falling half to death, and then being eaten by the monster beasts in the river. Therefore, Lu Chen was really in a desperate situation now. He had no way out and was at the end of his rope. He held his sword and pointed it at Lu Chen. His eyes were cold as he stared fixedly at Lu Chen and asked coldly, "Who are you? How do you know my brother?" Lu Chen clutched his chest and coughed. At the same time, a deep roar came from beside him. Atsu was standing beside him, glaring angrily at Hei, revealing a pair of sharp fangs. Hei's eyes swept across Atsu, his expression unchanging, as if he didn't see Atsu as a threat. He only stared at Lu Chen with a murderous look in his eyes and said coldly, "Speak. Otherwise, I will make you regret being born into this world." Lu Chen placed his left hand on Atsu's back and coughed again. Atsu turned to look at him, his eyes filled with concern. Lu Chen shook his head slightly and patted his chest as if he was in pain due to the injury. Atsu was stunned for a moment, and his eyes stayed on Lu Chen's palm for a moment. Then, Lu Chen looked up at He and said, "I know him, but I didn't have much contact with him in Kunlun Mountain." He frowned and his eyes softened a little, but he was still a little alert. He sneered and said, "Then why did you mention him?" "To run for my life." Lu Chen said without hesitation, "As long as I can distract you for a moment, that's enough." He was silent. He looked at Lu Chen with a murderous look in his eyes, but he thought of the day his brother died. He saw the bloody handwriting under his brother's badly mutilated body. That dark red word was like a needle, a thorn, instantly piercing Hei's heart, reminding him of that morning when he saw his only family member, his only brother, die in that courtyard. The dead could not be resurrected. Death meant eternal separation. No matter how many regrets there were, they could not make up for it. He felt that he owed his brother, He Gang, a lot. He should have taken good care of him and made him a talent. He had been obsessed with the path of immortality all his life and had no distracting thoughts. He only hoped that He Gang could marry a wife or find a Taoist companion in the future so that the He family could continue its lineage. However, all of this eventually turned into smoke and dissipated. He thought silently, but raised the long sword in his hand. With a hint of a sneer, he stretched it towards Lu Chen and said, "What other tricks do you have? Just use them." Lu Chen did not move. He only smiled bitterly and said, "Forget it, I'll take it as you've won." He sneered, but a hint of smugness flashed across his eyes. This was not because he had finally defeated Lu Chen, but because he thought of the extremely powerful perfected lord of the divine transformation realm in the Kunlun Mountain thousands of miles away. If he could bring this person's head back to the Kunlun Mountain and present it to perfected Lord Tianlan, he would definitely be extremely happy. A perfected lord's disciple, a Taoist title with the Tian character. Just thinking about these things was enough to make Hei's blood boil, and he yearned for them endlessly. Therefore, he decided not to delay any further. He looked at Lu Chen coldly and said, "I'll ask you one last time. Who exactly are you, and what's your relationship with perfected Lord Tianlan?" "What's my relationship with that damn Baldy?" Lu Chen grimaced and said with some pain, then he took a step back and said, "But I'm also very curious." Why don't you care about the others, and only target an insignificant person like me? He Yi's face darkened and he said, I'm the one asking you, not the other way around. Before he finished speaking, he suddenly saw Lu Chen raise one of his palms again from the corner of his eye, and a familiar black gas surged out again. He immediately flipped and retreated a few feet as if it was a conditioned reflex. At the same time, he sneered and said, Insignificant tricks. Do you still want to harm me again? This time, his voice suddenly came to a screeching halt. The reason was that Lu Chen had suddenly used a movement to force him back, but he didn't use any sinister methods like ink sand. Instead, he just silently turned around, and then rushed out with large strides. There was a cliff ahead. Behind him, He Yi's expression suddenly changed. With a roar, he rushed forward and reached out to grab Lu Chen's back at the same time. However, Lu Chen had used all his strength in this movement, and his speed was extremely fast. Just a moment before He Yi's palm could grab him, Lu Chen had abruptly jumped off the cliff that was several hundred meters high. The wind was piercingly cold and the waves were wild. The huge dragon river was just below him, and it was getting closer and closer at a rapid speed. Everything seemed to be coming to an end. He Yi, who was standing on the cliff, was shocked. Suddenly, a gust of wind rose beside him. It was the huge black wolf that had directly rushed out of the cliff and fell in the direction where Lu Chen had fallen. In midair, Atsu quickly caught up with Lu Chen. Lu Chen gritted his teeth and suddenly turned around to hug Atsu. After a while, their bodies became smaller and smaller, turning into a black dot that was almost invisible. In the end, with a loud bang, they fell directly into the most dangerous river in the land of chaos, the Dragon River, creating a huge splash. On the cliff, he was stunned, sword in hand. His face was blank and puzzled, but after a while, he snorted and turned around to walk back. Chapter 278. The water of the Longchuan was very, very cold. The water of the Longchuan was very, very deep. As soon as they fell into the water, because the cliff was too high, the force of the fall was too great, and they immediately rushed into the depths of the river. Intense sounds of bubbles and gurgling suddenly rang out, and the cold water pressed against them from all directions. At that moment, there was only a dazzling white in front of them. Apart from the water splashes and bubbles, they could see nothing else. But Lu Chen's hand was still tightly holding onto Atsu, holding onto this companion who would not leave him even in the face of death. After rushing down the river for an unknown distance, as the buoyancy of the water increased, the momentum quickly decreased, and Lu Chen and Atsu's bodies finally slowed down. But then, a powerful undercurrent suddenly rolled up in the depths of the river, directly wrapping their bodies together and rushing forward. Lu Chen and Atsu's bodies were involuntarily drifting with the current. In fact, jumping from such a high place into the water, the recoil force was also terrifying. Atsu's body was in a better state, and its body was extraordinarily tough. But the impact that Lu Chen received was even more severe. He was dizzy, his chest was stuffy, and he was seeing stars. He almost fainted again. Fortunately, he was tough and strong, and he knew that this was a matter of life and death, and he must not lose his mind, so he tried his best to stay awake. But in the depths of such a terrible river, being wrapped by countless undercurrents, the power was so strong that he could not do much. At this moment, suddenly, Atsu, who was hugging Lu Chen's body tightly, suddenly raised its head, and its eyes were filled with fear, as if it was suddenly nervous and excited. Lu Chen immediately felt that Atsu's body was strange, because almost all of its muscles seemed to have tightened in an instant. A gigantic shadow appeared from the depths of the Dragon River and began to rapidly approach them. Before the shadow could even reach them, the water current from that direction was like a raging tide, causing Lu Chen and Atsu to tumble a few times in the water. The sound of rolling and crashing water began to ring out fiercely, and the whole underwater world began to churn crazily. Suddenly, a large school of arm-sized fish rushed over from another direction, and the sharp teeth in the water were like incomparably sharp blades, rushing towards the flesh and blood in the water. More shadows appeared, wave after wave, wave after wave. The whole calm Longchuan River seemed to be boiling, and countless terrible creatures swarmed over. They were bloodthirsty, crazy, and ferocious. Even before they rushed over, some of the ferocious creatures directly pounced on them. The big fish ate the small fish, and the monsters killed the big fish. Blood flowed and dyed the river red. Above their heads, below their feet, in all directions, under this terrible and deep river, countless ferocious creatures looked around, and there was only despair left. Lu Chen did not hesitate anymore. He hugged Atsu tightly with one hand and pressed his other hand on his chest. The huge shadow behind him and under his feet had already rushed forward, and suddenly rose up. The whole Longchuan River suddenly rose by 10 feet. A wave of spiritual power flashed, and time seemed to freeze for a moment in the depths of the river. Then, Lu Chen and Atsu's bodies suddenly disappeared, and the little gap was immediately flooded by the river. The shadow fell down and crushed everything. All the monster fish instantly scattered, but where the shadow passed, a large number of creatures were directly pulled back by the surging tide, and then disappeared into the depths of the shadow. Blood flowed and floated in the river, and then quickly thinned and disappeared. Everything became quiet again, and everything returned to its original state. Only a tiny seed silently appeared in this vast, ocean-like river. It was circled by a wave, knocked away by a passing monster, staggered, and floated down. Suddenly, it was seen by a swimming big fish and swallowed. After a moment, it seemed that the seed was too hard. The big fish shook its body, tilted its head, and spat it out again. Then, it swam away leisurely. A string of bubbles rose from the water, and the seed rolled a few times. Then, it was gradually taken away in the water, and disappeared into the depths. On Mount Kunlun, in the side hall behind the Xingyang Hall of Tiankuan Peak, this was originally a place for the Yuanying stage spiritual masters to meet and discuss matters. Now, it had been temporarily used by perfected Lord Tianlan as a place to meet guests. Of course, with perfected Tianlan's current status, as well as his supreme prestige in the Kunlun sect, no one would say anything about it, not even the acting sect master Qian Deng, who now had great power. As time passed, it was getting longer and longer until the night of the intense changes of the full moon. The situation in the Kunlun party also became clearer and more stable. It seemed that everyone had accepted the current situation. In any case, they couldn't fight against the sect master, so they just accepted it. Otherwise, who would be dissatisfied and shout a few words at the deity transformation stage spiritual master? However, perfected Lord Tianlan usually didn't care too much about the chores in the sect. Most of the time, he let Qian Deng handle things. Most of the time, he was elusive, and it was rare to see him. However, on this day, he appeared behind the Xingyang Hall and met a few people in the side hall. Zhuxian brought White Lotus and stood in front of the deity transformation stage spiritual master. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked down and sized up the little girl who looked to be in her early teens. At this moment, White Lotus seemed to be a little nervous. Her face was slightly pale, and she didn't dare to look directly at perfected Lord Tianlan. She just silently looked at the ground in front of her. After a long time, she didn't say a word and just stood there motionlessly. Perfected Lord Tianlan didn't get angry, but there was a strange look in his eyes. It couldn't be said to be angry, but it seemed to be a more complicated expression. He looked at the little girl and seemed to be thinking about something. After a while, the situation still didn't change. Zhuxian, who was standing at the side, couldn't stand it anymore. He coughed lightly and whispered to White Lotus, "Quickly greet Uncle Master." White Lotus's lips moved, and for the first time, she raised her head to look at Supreme Tianlan. She saw a bald, fat man. Her lips moved a few times, and then she silently knelt down and kowtowed 3 times on the ground. Perfected Lord Tianlan revealed a faint smile and said, "Why are you kneeling in front of me?" White Lotus lowered her head and knelt on the ground. After a while, she said, "Uncle Master, please spare my life." Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed and said, "You're really a smart child. No wonder I heard that my senior brother liked you the most in his later years. Come, tell me, what does senior brother usually say about me?" White Lotus said, "Do you want to hear the truth or a lie?" Perfected Lord Tunlon smiled and said, "Of course the truth." White Lotus said with an O, and said, "When Master was still alive, he told me, second senior brother, and eldest senior brother, that although you're talented and bold, you're too ambitious and want too much. We can't allow you to control the power of Kunlun. Otherwise, the orthodoxy of our Kunlun party that has been passed down for 5,000 years will be destroyed." The side hall instantly fell silent. Wuxia, who was standing at the side, suddenly turned abnormally pale. Chapter 279. Perfected Lord Tianlon was silent. His eyes flickered slightly as he stared at White Lotus. The hall was silent. If he didn't speak, no one dared to say a word. No one knew what he was thinking at the moment and whether he would be enraged or angry. If he was enraged, the hall would probably be filled with dead people. The atmosphere seemed to freeze and time seemed to stop as well. After an unknown period of time, Perfected Lord Tianlon suddenly stood up and walked down from his seat. He walked to White Lotus and stared at her for a moment before saying indifferently, "You're quite bold at such a young age. Did my senior brother teach you all this as well?" His fat body just stood there casually. He did not look ferocious, nor did he give off an oppressive aura. However, there was a majestic aura that made White Lotus speechless. After waiting for a moment, Perfected Lord Tianlon turned to look at Wuxia and said, "What about you? Have you heard Senior Brother Bai Chen say these words before?" Under the bright and somewhat dazzling gaze of this soul formation Perfected Lord, Wuxia's legs also turned to jelly. He laughed dryly and sweat appeared on his forehead. After hesitating for a moment, he still said softly, "Junior sister didn't lie. I've indeed heard Master say this once before." With his hands behind his back, Perfected Lord Tianlon slowly walked to the window at the side and raised his hand to look at the sky. His expression was indifferent and no one could tell what changes were going on in his heart. After a while, he said slowly, "Senior brother and I have known each other for a lifetime, but he never understood my feelings. It really makes me feel regretful. We're brothers. If we meet again in the netherworld in the future, I'll naturally tell him my feelings. Get up." The last sentence was said to White Lotus, who was still kneeling on the ground. White Lotus responded softly and stood up to walk to Wuxia's side, standing there quietly. Perfected Lord Tianlon swept his gaze across the two of them and said a moment later, "White Lotus." White Lotus did not reply and stood with her head lowered. Wuxia, who was at the side, sighed and lightly touched White Lotus. White Lotus then said in a low voice, "Your disciple is here." Perfected Lord Tianlon said indifferently, "Senior brother has unfortunately passed away, leaving behind 3 disciples. As their martial uncle, I can't just sit by and do nothing. Your eldest senior brother and second senior brother have already been settled. You're the only one left." At this point, White Lotus suddenly raised her head and glanced at Wuxia beside her. Wuxia's expression was calm and collected, as if he was indifferent to this. After a while, White Lotus slowly lowered her head again. "You're the only one who hasn't settled down. Speaking of which, your aptitude is extremely high and you're a rare talent of the 5 pillars. If you can cultivate in peace, you'll definitely bring glory to our Kunlun lineage in the future. However, given the current situation, I think you have 2 paths in front of you." The corners of White Lotus's mouth twitched slightly and a hint of anger flashed across the depths of her eyes. However, she still clenched her teeth and did not say anything. Perfected Lord Tianlon didn't seem to notice the slight change in her expression. He just said calmly, "First of all, I also feel pity for your outstanding talent. If you're willing, you can temporarily join me as an in-name disciple and cultivate first. If you're successful in the future, you can also formally acknowledge me as your master." Bai Lian was stunned for a moment, as if she was surprised by that. However, her face turned pale very quickly because Perfected Lord Tianlan's voice sounded again. "It's just that the Dermic Dao that I've learned is very different from Senior Brother Bai Chen's and it's incompatible. If you want to become my disciple, you'll have to abolish all the superficial techniques that you've learned previously." Wuxia, who was standing to the side, also had a slight change in expression. A trace of pity flashed across his eyes, But he quickly hid this little bit of pity. White Lotus stood on the spot and asked softly after a while, "May I ask if there's a second path, Uncle Master?" Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded. "There is. Secondly, that senior brother of mine has already passed away. However, he was once a peerless and peerless perfected lord who looked down on the world. How can such an outstanding person end up in a situation where no one cares about him even after his death? The rock mountain where Winter Peak crashed is senior brother by Chen's tomb. Since you're free now, go and keep watch for him. It won't be too late to come and find me when you've thought it through." White Lotus's body trembled slightly. She raised her head and wanted to say something, but she held back and turned to look at Xianxia. Xianxia nodded. "How about this, Uncle Master? Little junior sister has just returned to the mountain after all and is still unaware of some things. Furthermore, she's still young and insensible, so please give her a few more days. I'll send her to stay at the rock mountain first. Firstly, it'll be to keep watch for Master, and secondly, it'll be to enlighten her. Is that all right?" Perfected Lord Tianlan replied, "Sure." Xianxia bowed deeply to him, then left with White Lotus. White Lotus seemed a little disappointed, but she still followed him obediently in the end. Just as they left, another person happened to walk in as well. It was Xianxia, and he exchanged glances and nodded slightly before brushing past each other a moment later. Disciple he greets Perfected Lord. When there were only the two of them left in the hall, he walked to the back of Perfected Lord Tianlan, bowed respectfully, and spoke first. Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced at him indifferently before returning to the main seat and sitting down. "You're back. How was your trip to the land of chaos?" He cupped his fists and said with a smile, "I'm glad that I didn't disappoint you. I've specially come to report the good news to you." Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him quietly. For some reason, the gentleness that had always been on his face suddenly disappeared as he merely nodded. "Oh, tell me about it. What's the good news?" Disciple entered deep into the chaotic land and pursued for thousands of miles. Finally, at the Dragon River, I blocked the evil cult spy and killed him with my own hands. His corpse fell into the Dragon River. It can be said that he died without a burial place. Perfected Lord Tianlan's pupils constricted slightly as he asked in a deep voice, "You killed that person?" "That's right." He Yi's expression was awe-inspiring, his demeanor unafraid. He said in a clear voice, "These evil people of the devil cult have committed all kinds of evil, bringing disaster to the people of the righteous path of the world. As a disciple of Kunlun sect, it is my duty to enforce justice on behalf of heaven, to eliminate evil and promote good." Perfected Lord Tianlan did not say anything and merely looked at Yi quietly. Being stared at by him, he felt a little excited in his heart. He took another step forward and said, "Disciple's trip this time is also to prove to you that Disciple is talented enough to take you as a disciple. I will definitely not disappoint you. Even that Tian Daoist name, Disciple, has the confidence to bring glory to you. You want to be my disciple after killing that person and even want the Tian Dao title?" Perfected Lord Tianlan stood up slowly and stared at him. His expression gradually turned complicated as though a strange emotion was lingering in his heart. A faint but intense heartbeat rumbled in a certain quiet corner. "Yes, please grant my wish, Perfected Lord." He knelt on the ground. Perfected Lord Tianlan stood at a high place and looked down at that person. His eyes seemed to be filled with wind, clouds, and lightning. Chapter 280. The black tail moved on the ground, and a small piece of the tail was missing. The wound was smooth and neat, and it looked like it was cut by a sharp blade. After a while, the black tail curled up and hid under its body. Then Atsu's ears suddenly pricked up, and its body, which was originally curled up on the ground, suddenly stood up, as if it was suddenly awakened from its sleep. It looked around in a trance and fear. The mottled old tree wall appeared in front of its eyes, and it could vaguely see the outline of the two opposite doors. On the ground not far away, there was a familiar-looking puddle. The water in the puddle was clear and transparent, and occasionally there would be a string of bubbles. "Don't be so suspicious. This is a tree hole. There won't be a whole river of Longchuan suddenly pouring down from above us. A somewhat lazy voice came from the other side of the puddle. Atsu looked up and saw Lu Chen sitting with his back against the tree wall. He was frowning and changing the medicine on his wounds. Occasionally, he would grimace and say to Atsu, "Stupid dog, come and help me." Atsu jumped up and trotted to Lu Chen's side. It then used its teeth to bite the cloth that Lu Chen handed over to it. After Lu Chen applied medicine to the wound, with Atsu's help, the wound was safely and neatly bandaged up. At this moment, Lu Chen's complexion looked much better than before. His face was no longer pale, and there was a little redder. After he moved his arms and body, he nodded with satisfaction and said, "It should be fine in another 5 or 6 days." Atsu barked twice. Lu Chen looked at it and said with a smile, "How is it? Now you know how powerful I am? I have stored a lot of food, medicine, and all kinds of clothes in this tree hole. What do you call this?" This is what you call foresight." Atsu's ears drooped, and he looked very happy. He even rubbed his head against Lu Chen's body. Lu Chen smiled and pushed its head away, then stood up and walked to one side of the tree hole. There was a large pile of things there which looked like a hill. Lu Chen rummaged in it for a while, then took out 2 pieces of dried meat and threw them directly to Atsu. Atsu bit it and immediately began to chew. Lu Chen looked at Atsu and shook his head with a smile. Although he looked relaxed, there was still a trace of worry in his eyes. As early as when he was on the mountain of Kunlun, he had more or less a hunch in his heart. In order to be safe, he secretly prepared these things in this tree hole in secret. As a result, it really came in handy at the critical moment. However, even though he had considered all the details and had even included Atsu's portion, he had not expected that Atsu, this stupid dog, would have a huge appetite to begin with. After he had advanced to become a holy beast, this fellow's appetite seemed to have increased by more than 1-fold. Lu Chen found it hard to imagine how this big black dog could eat so much. However, when he thought about it carefully, there were actually some clues to the reason behind it. When they met again after the night of the full moon, Atsu almost no longer ate ordinary food. Its favorite food was the flesh of monsters full of vitality, and the fresher it was, the more it liked it. However, of course, there was no such condition in this tree hole, so after starving for a while, this stupid dog quickly lost the moral integrity of a holy beast. No matter what it was, as long as it could eat, it would eat with relish. However, the price of this was that its appetite was shockingly huge, and the food it had was rapidly decreasing. Besides that, there was another problem in front of Lu Chen that gave him a headache, and that was how to get out. In the past, when Lu Chen had this mysterious seed, he was extremely careful every time he went in and out of this mysterious tree hole. Not only did he have to choose an extremely secluded place, but he also chose to enter in the dead of night, so as to minimize all possible external interference. This was because it was extremely dangerous to go out after entering this tree hole. It was impossible to detect any changes in the outside world, and if someone were to ambush him, it would be extremely dangerous. It was precisely because of this that Lu Chen did not use the seed even though he had encountered a few dangerous moments along the way. It was only after he fell into the Longchuan River that he was forced to hide with Atsu because the river water blocked his line of sight from the shore and there were many monsters swarming towards him from the river. It was really a matter of life and death. Lu Chen had no choice but to hide in the river with Atsu. However, it was easy to come in, but it was very dangerous to go out. At this time, Lu Chen basically knew nothing about the situation outside of the seed. The seed was currently in the depths of the Longchuan River. The moment it went out, it would immediately be crushed to death by the huge waves. Even if it was not crushed to death, the countless monsters in the river, as long as the seed fell near them, it would basically die. Another example was that the Longchuan River was very long, but no one knew where the river flowed to. They only knew that the river would eventually turn into the depths of the disorienting lands. In other words, when they went out, even if the seed was not in the Longchuan River, it was very likely to be in the more dangerous central region. Once they went out, they might open their eyes and see a monster the size of a mountain slapping them. In short, if they had no other choice but to hide in the tree hole, the situation would be really troublesome when they went out. Lu Chen thought about this for a long time, but ultimately could not come up with a good idea. In the end, he could only put these thoughts aside. This mysterious and ancient tree hole was isolated from the rest of the world. There were two clearly defined doors embedded in the tree wall, but they couldn't be opened at all. Instead, they had to rely on the spiritual connection between Lu Chen and the seed to get in and out of here. However, it was strange. Although there was no airflow or wind in this tree hole, it was not stuffy at all. Also, there was a puddle on the ground of the tree hole. These days, whether it was Lu Chen or Atsu, they had been drinking water from it, but the clear water in the puddle did not subside at all. It looked like this small world was self-contained. If there was enough food, and if one was not afraid of being lonely all year round, one could really live in this place for a long time. However, the food that Lu Chen brought seemed to be a little tight, and he himself felt that if he stayed in this tree hole for too long, he would most likely go crazy. Therefore, he had to leave this place sooner or later. Yes, he had to leave before he starved to death. Lu Chen thought so in his heart, then he walked to the edge of the puddle and squatted down. Atsu buried its head in eating the meat that was destined to not be full. It looked up at Lu Chen and thought for a moment. A dog paw stretched forward, but it pushed a piece of meat in front of Lu Chen. Lu Chen looked down and laughed. He reached out and touched Atsu's head. He smiled and said, "I'm not hungry, you can eat it yourself." Atsu obediently scooped up the piece of meat and looked very happy as he continued to tear it apart. Lu Chen looked at the water. A long time ago, when he came here for the first time, the water was not so transparent. At that time, the entire puddle was filled with unimaginably abundant life essence, and even the color of the water was light green. But now, things had naturally changed. At this moment, the water was clear and transparent, and it could be seen at a glance. When Lu Chen looked over, he could still see the strange cluster of black fire at the bottom of the puddle, burning silently in the water. At the same time, not far from the black fire, there was a spirit herb about the thickness of a baby's arm, white and tender in color, and shaped like a lotus root. It was one of the spirit herbs that Atsu stole from the Kunlun party's fragrance garden during the big earthquake in Kunlun Mountain. It was called black mud lotus. On that day, Lu Chen hid those spirit herbs in this tree hole, and the other spirit herbs were placed on the ground. Only this black mud lotus could not survive without water, so it was thrown into this puddle that day. After that, things happened one after another, and there was almost no time to breathe. Lu Chen almost never came here again, so he had long forgotten about this matter. But at this moment, when he looked at this black mud lotus again, Lu Chen suddenly frowned slightly. He felt that there was something strange. It was just separated by a layer of water, but the black mud lotus under the water was somewhat blurry and could not be seen clearly. After he pondered for a moment, he rolled up his sleeves and knelt by the water. Then he slowly reached his hand into the water and grabbed the black mud lotus. Atsu, who was eating at the side, also seemed to feel something. After looking over, he also stood up, rolled up his tongue, and walked over to look into the water. This originally quiet tree hole, at this moment, suddenly seemed to be even more silent. There was not even the slightest sound. Only when Lu Chen's hand reached in, the water splashed, and the bubbles rose, making a little crashing sound. The misty green gas slowly flowed on the tree wall, twining in the gaps of the ancient bark. There were also the two doors that had been silent for a long time, as if they were silently staring at the human below. That hand reached into the water and grabbed downwards. The water rippled and slid, and then a string of bubbles of different sizes rose up. For some reason, the bubbles appeared particularly bright and lustrous. In every spherical bubble, there was a reflection, which was Lu Chen's face. As if thousands of illusions of the world were gathered here. Lu Chen's hand paused for a moment. He stared at these bubbles, and after a moment he continued to reach downwards. This piece of water began to shake, as if there was a very slight wave, slowly surging. But after a moment, Lu Chen's hand finally touched the surface of the black mud lotus. There was a slippery feeling to the touch, as if it was no different from the feeling when he first obtained this spirit herb. Lu Chen's heart let out a sigh of relief. He raised his arm, and when he was about to stand up with it, suddenly his body stiffened. The black mud lotus swayed a few times in the water, and the water swayed even more violently, but this spirit herb did not leave the water. Lu Chen coldly looked through the water, and saw that one end of the black mud lotus had unknowingly pierced into the soil under the water, as if it had already taken root. And on the other side, the black fire, not far away, also slowly swayed a few times. Chapter 281. Lu Chen's brows furrowed, and he was a little startled for a moment. He had experienced many twists and turns in the past, so he knew quite a lot about many kinds of complex spirit herbs. However, he probably only knew how to identify their shapes, appearances, and uses. Naturally, he would not carefully remember more. He knew about the black mud lotus, but after thinking for a long time, he couldn't remember if this spirit herb would take root and germinate by itself once it was placed in water. After pondering for a moment, he tried to pull it up again. Who knew that this black mud lotus seemed to have taken root very firmly? Even with his strength, he couldn't move it. Following Lu Chen's movement, the surrounding water seemed to be shaking more and more violently. A string of bubbles kept floating up, and at the same time, there was a gurgling sound of water. This sound echoed in this unusually quiet and mysterious tree hole. It seemed a bit abrupt, and for some reason, there seemed to be some echoes. Atu suddenly raised his head, his eyes looking up, and then he let out a low roar. Lu Chen's arm that was grabbing the black mud lotus paused for a moment. He looked back at us. After a moment, he let go of the black mud lotus and slowly stood up. In such a big tree hole, the echo seemed insignificant and was slowly disappearing. The water around him also slowly calmed down, and everything quickly returned to its original state. Lu Chen didn't do anything else. He just frowned and looked at the surrounding ancient tree walls. His eyes seemed to have a thoughtful look. There was no day or night in the cave, and he didn't know the rotation of the sun and moon. Lu Chen could only rely on the speed of his own recovery to roughly judge the passage of time. When the wounds on his body were basically healed, Lu Chen also discovered that the food he stored in this tree hole was almost used up. That stupid dog, known as the Holy Beast, really ate too much. It seemed that no matter what, he had to go and gamble. He hoped that his luck would be good enough when he went out. If possible, with Lu Chen's temperament, he actually didn't want to gamble this time. However, he had already explored every inch of this mysterious ancient tree hole for so many years, and there was no other way out. He stood up and walked to the side of the tree hole. The items that were originally piled up like a small hill were now only a thin layer. Lu Chen's eyes swept across and began to squat down to clean up. There were also some spirit herbs and sundries that were placed on one side, and food was placed on the other. At this time, there was movement behind him. It turned out that Atsu had also walked over. Its eyes were shining as it looked at the remaining food, and it had a greedy look. Lu Chen smiled and patted Atsu's head. He didn't seem to be angry at all. He casually pulled a few pieces of dried meat in front of Atsu, and then said, "Eat." Atsu stuck out its tongue and licked its mouth. Just as it lowered its head and was about to eat, it suddenly looked at Lu Chen and seemed to be a little embarrassed. It groaned a few times, then slowly stretched out a front foot and patted Lu Chen's hand. Lu Chen laughed and reached out his hand to hug Atsu's neck. He said, "Eat when you are full, we will leave this place. Let's gamble and rush out, life or death will be up to fate." Atsu barked and seemed to be very happy. Then it lowered its head and began to eat. Lu Chen smiled and looked at Atsu for a while, then turned back and continued to tidy up. But after a while, he suddenly saw something lying in a corner of a tree hole. He couldn't help but be startled for a moment, then he reached out and picked it up. This was the half of the fire god's staff that he got from the barbarian tribe. It was the same as when he first got it. This half of the ancient and damaged staff was lifeless, cracked and withered. It looked like it was useless other than using it as firewood to make a stove. But of course, the truth shouldn't be like this. That day in the barbarian tribe, the various strange abilities of this fire god's staff were still clearly remembered by Lu Chen. What was more special was that this fire god's staff could faintly resonate with the strange black fire power in his body. This was the main reason why he disregarded the danger and wanted to get this wooden staff in his hands. But at this moment, the fire god's staff didn't seem to have any spiritual power. No matter how Lu Chen tried to test it these days, there was no reaction. In the end, he could only casually throw it in this corner. After all, in this ancient and mysterious tree hole, no matter how powerful the fire god's staff was, it was not as precious as a bit of food. Holding the fire god's staff and silently stroking it, Lu Chen was silent. Suddenly, his heart moved. He turned his head to look at the puddle behind him, and then walked over with large strides. In the days that he stayed in the tree hole, Lu Chen tried many ways to test the fire god's staff. Of course, he also used the black fire power in his body. But whether it was because the fire god's staff had consumed too much spiritual power, or because the black fire power in Lu Chen's body was not enough, the fire god's staff did not have any reaction. But just now, Lu Chen suddenly thought of another thing. In this ancient tree hole, there was another black fire. It was a cluster of black flames that burned under the puddle, but still did not extinguish in the water. Thinking back to that extremely dangerous scene, Lu Chen desperately dug out the black fire in his body and relied on the water of life to forcibly extend his life. In that process, most of the power of the black flame curse was in the cluster of black flames under the water. Maybe this would be of some use? Lu Chen lowered his head to look at the cluster of black flames in the water. Looking at it now, the black flame was small and quiet. It was impossible to tell how vicious and sinister it had been in the past 10 years. It had almost tortured Lu Chen to the point where he wished he was dead. Lu Chen exhaled softly and calmed his mind. Then he took the fire god's staff and began to reach into the cluster of black flames under the water. The moment the wooden staff entered the water, the clear water wet the wood. Suddenly, 7 small whirlpools appeared in the water around the wooden staff. The water swirled in them, and the water seemed to tremble slightly. Lu Chen's eyes lit up. This kind of phenomenon had never happened before. It seemed that the fire god's staff's reaction in this puddle was indeed somewhat different. He held the fire god's staff and paused in the water for a moment. When he found that there were no more phenomena other than the few whirlpools, he began to try to continue reaching down. The fire god's staff went deeper and deeper in the water, and the surrounding water trembled more and more violently. The water in the whirlpools began to flow faster and faster. The surface of the entire puddle seemed to have faint ripples because of the violent tremors. After another moment, Lu Chen suddenly felt the fire god's staff in his hand tremble violently. A gentle spiritual power was transmitted from the wooden staff and then dissipated. And under the water, the cluster of black flames seemed to feel something. It suddenly swelled a little and began to sway back and forth. The fire god's staff was still descending, getting closer and closer to the black flames. Suddenly, a large number of bubbles of various sizes suddenly floated up. It was unknown how many times more than what Lu Chen had seen before. The transparent outer walls of each bubble reflected all kinds of shadows, but they were not the shadows of Lu Chen. In those bubbles, there was the vault of heaven and earth, all things in the world, all living beings, the passing of time, the destruction of the void, the various states of life, the joys and sorrows of separation and reunion. Thousands of worlds were only in the illusory bubbles. Just like that, they were unguarded in front of Lu Chen's eyes. The body of the fire god's staff began to heat up. The withered old would seem to suddenly be reborn. Lines and lines of spiritual power appeared on the body of the staff, forming mysterious and strange runes that slowly lit up. At the same time, there was a whistling sound in the surrounding water, and the 7 whirlpools suddenly widened several times. The water waves jumped fiercely, and some even jumped out of the water. All the bubbles rushed to the surface of the water as if they were flying, and burst, bringing along the illusory bubbles into nothingness. On the surface of the water, the cluster of black flames violently swayed for a moment. Then, it left the bottom of the water and slowly floated up towards the fire god's staff. The fire god's staff trembled incessantly. It was as if it was extremely excited, welcoming the power that it had long desired. Like a clap of thunder in the silence, like a roar in the underworld, the dark eyes suddenly looked back from the depths of time, passing through the years, reaching the other shore and landing on him. The black flames lit up in Lu Chen's eyes, burning fiercely. At that moment, the black flames in the water finally landed on the fire god's staff. In an instant, all the totem runes on the fire god's staff lit up together. The surrounding water rumbled, and in a moment, it was as if a huge thunder roared. The entire pool of water rushed up 2 feet into the air, and then immediately fell back down. The fire god's staff trembled and whistled. It struggled free from Lu Chen's hands and floated up. It circled in the air a few times, and the black flames ignited from the tip of the fire god's staff. In the blink of an eye, it covered all the totem runes. It looked as if the entire staff was engulfed by the black flames, but it also looked as if the black flames had been reborn, burning fiercely on the ancient staff. A mysterious and vast power seemed to descend from the void, pouring into the fire god's staff. A burst of dazzling light shone, like the sun that could not be looked at directly. Lu Chen covered his eyes with his hands and took a step back. Then, he felt that the light gradually calmed down, and the majestic and terrifying power in the surroundings also gradually calmed down. The fire god's staff in the air gradually calmed down, and the totem runes slowly disappeared. But at this moment, the fire god's staff no longer looked withered. The entire staff looked smooth and tough. In other words, the fire god's staff seemed to be more like a legendary divine treasure. Lu Chen stretched out his hand to catch the fire god's staff. He carefully tested it, and found that there didn't seem to be anything wrong. After a moment of silence, he tried waving it twice, but there was no reaction. Could it be that after making such a big commotion just now, it only became a slightly better-looking wooden staff? Lu Chen scratched his head. After thinking for a moment, he tried to circulate the power of the black flames in his body. Sure enough, there was a reaction. The totem on the fire god's staff quickly lit up, but it seemed that it was just like that. When the power of the black flames stimulated it, the fire god's staff also lit up at the same time. Other than that, there was no other strange phenomenon. There was neither the power to destroy heaven and earth, nor the means to kill the enemy. Lu Chen tried for a while, but it was still the same. In the end, he could only sigh, shrug his shoulders, and put it aside. Then, he turned to look at Atsu and said, "Are you full? Let's go out." You're tuning in to the Wandering Hero YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories,